Here. Mayor Niss. Councilmember Koo. Here. Councilmember Scharf.
Here.
Councilmember Tanaka. Councilmember Wolbach.
Here.
6 present.
And Mayor Niss and Councilmember and Vice Mayor Filseth are both recused, and that's why they're not here. If we want to move on to, we have any oral communications for items not on the agenda? Then we'll move on to item number 1, which is the Council Rail Committee's recommends the City Council move forward with the community engagement plan as developed by staff and AECOM, including the creation of a community advisory panel. Do we have a presentation?
Yes, we do. Thank you. This is Rob DeGose, Deputy City Manager. I'm pleased to be here this evening, and we're joined with our AECOM consultant team. Eddie Mercurio is the project manager, and Eileen Goodwin, who's from Apex Strategies, who's overseeing the community engagement program with city staff. And Eileen's going to begin with the presentation. Let me just say a little bit about her. She has over 30 years of experience in building consensus and in completing complex projects involving numerous parties on time and within budget. She's the principal of Apex Strategies, counseling and assisting public agencies and private parties. She's well recognized around the state and nationally as an expert innovator in the field of communication participation. And if that wasn't enough, she's also got quite a lot of experience in grade separation locally here in Menlo Park and Sunnyvale and Burlingame. So we're really pleased to have her on board, and she has a brief presentation for you this evening.
All right, well, good evening. Can everyone hear me? Is this working? Okay, thank you. So thank you very much for having us this evening, and I will make my presentation brief. We did get a chance to meet with the council subcommittee and take both council direct subcommittee comments and questions and direction, as well as some of the public testimony that was given that day. So this is a slightly revised version to take into account that excellent set of suggestions. The roles that we see here is clearly the City of Palo Alto is the lead for the public involvement. There is a role for the Caltrain Joint Powers Board, which owns and operates the rail line and is a partner in the screening effort. And the community of Palo Alto, both its residents and businesses, are encouraged to participate as users and neighbors of the proposed grade separation projects. There's quite a few goals for our outreach effort, and I'll briefly go over those for those who can't maybe read this from as far away. We would like to have this outreach effort have the community understand and agree on the problem that we're attempting to solve with the ultimate preferred solution. We would propose that the team that's proposing ideas, the AECOM team and its engineers and technical sub-consultants, and the alternatives and solutions would be the correct group to do so. So there's credibility built there. That people believe that the process was fair and transparent, that the trade-offs were understood, and that all parties were acknowledged and considered as part of the outreach process and the entire process. That the community would understand the funding constraints and opportunities related to the preferred solution and other ideas. That community members, businesses, and all stakeholders would partner with the team to gather information and ideas to develop the best grade separation scenarios that satisfy multiple interests. And finally, that should we land on a preferred scenario, that this would process would help develop partnerships for future funding opportunities. Well, so how are we going to do this? This outreach proposal and plan is very meeting centric and very meeting heavy, and we have created a community engagement schedule and graphic that attempts to explain these groups and meetings. And so I'd like to camp out on this slide for a moment to show that it's our proposal that we would be starting work starting in the summertime, as in next month, this month, and that the CAP, this is the Community Advisory Panel that has become part of this, motion for approval, and I'll explain in detail what that would be, as well as our technical groups begin to meet over the summer. Our first community, and I'll be going into more detail in future slides, that big pile of boxes there in August is attempting to show that we'd be having our first community meeting in August, and this would be those blue boxes that you see. We would also be doing some online engagement, and again, I'll go into more detail there. Those are the yellow boxes that the Citizen or Community Advisory Panel, these are the orange boxes. They would be also convened at this similar time frame, as well as the Technical Advisory Committee and the Rail Subcommittee of the Council. The green boxes below are attempting to show that there would be outreach in the summer-fall timeframe to stakeholder groups, and these are probably more targeted groups. Maybe they're business affiliated folks or perhaps the real estate community, and I'll again get into that in a little bit more detail. The red boxes where you see the tracks kind of take a deviation for some direction there, those are our city council meetings where all of this feedback will be directly given to the city council at key milestones during the project as we move forward. And also what this graphic is attempting to show with the gold star is that we're hopeful to get to a recommended alternative before the end of the year. So, in a little more detail, what is this CAP, or Community Advisory Panel? It's our hope that the city manager would be able to convene a group of probably about a dozen people. That's not a hard and fast number, but it is a target number. And these folks would be advising the project team, and meaning the AECOM team as well as the city staff on a variety of topics. It's our thinking that the meetings would begin in July. There would be 6 of them during the process between July and December. And the thought is that these meetings would be held in perhaps not at this time frame, because we heard a lot of feedback about that at the meeting, that 3 to 5:30 is probably not an ideal time. We're now potentially looking at maybe morning meetings. The idea here is that this smaller group would be project liaisons. They would collaborate with the project team. They would help proof all the materials that we would be using to communicate with the broader public. It's our hope they would be representative of different neighborhoods along the corridor, and that they would, the folks that would be asked to join would take this seriously and come to all the meetings, so that we'd be building up a book of knowledge, if you will, and that they would come prepared to the meetings because there's likely to be homework. We're also hoping that they provide honest feedback. And specific tasks would include receiving briefings on technical issues, and there was a question about this at the subcommittee, and we definitely would want to have the technical advisory members coming to some of these meetings to report out and receive feedback. And by those types of groups, I'm talking about Caltrain staff or maybe other staff people as appropriate for other agencies and partner entities, as well as the technical sub-consultants from the AECOM team, whether they're within AECOM's staff or actually consulted out from that. So for example, the traffic folks would likely be reporting directly to and receiving feedback from this community advisory panel. And then, as I mentioned, the hope, because these folks are representing different parts of the community and maybe even riders of the system, that they would use their networks to communicate back out the positive and factual information that they gather by being part of this panel. The next group that I mentioned is the stakeholder meetings. The plan calls for up to 3. And that list on the right is obviously longer than 3, but we're not totally quite sure yet which are the right groups to be doing this additional outreach to, where they could convene a large enough group that we would go and meet them where they already are. Because we know from experience, and as was mentioned, I've worked on a lot of grade separation projects, including Mountain View, where there was a large a business community, Broadway in Burlingame, again, a business community where we went to them and had a meeting specifically for those business owners because they were going to be impacted, for example, by a certain project design. So it's that type of thing. We're also thinking, as I mentioned, about real estate groups, maybe Stanford, et cetera. And these meetings would be customized to the topics that would be most germane to them, and frankly, probably the geographic area that would be most relatable to them. Although certainly we would would be able to answer questions from that group on any part of the scope of work we'd be working on. The community meetings for the broader community, we're, as I mentioned, planning for 3 in this 6-month window. And the first one, we already have a date. So for those of you in the audience, we are hoping to have our first meeting on August 23rd from 6 to 8 p.m. And help me, it's in the community room. I think so. Community room here in Palo Alto. And because we recognize that we're coming into this community process, we're not starting from scratch. You all have been meeting on this topic about grade separations and other rail-related issues now for many years. There was some interest and feedback we got at the subcommittee meeting that we're very much taking to heart. And one thing we want to be able to do is to build a community meeting format where people are able to directly interface with the project team and the technical experts, and not necessarily sit and talk to one another, which I guess has been a format that's been used in some of the other meetings. There was some feedback that couldn't we start to talk more directly to some of the experts, so we've taken that to heart. And also there was some interest in trying to piece these 3 meetings into single topic meetings. Thinking about that since our last meeting, I think that will be quite hard to do, just because we're moving so quickly and there are several topics we need to be able to move forward on at every meeting. So our proposal would be, there might be some themes, and definitely we want to take a bunch of topics from the first meeting through the 3rd meeting, and maybe some of the meetings will focus more on those topics than others. But definitely we've heard some strong feedback. What's nice about working with Etty and her team is that they have excellent graphics, and I think that that's one thing that we've definitely built into the expectations of the community outreach plan and the AECOM scope. And as you see here, we, especially in the 2nd meeting and the 3rd meeting, we would be actually proposing to show 3D images and renderings, as well as potentially some flyovers and that type of thing. And we have found that once you get whatever the proposed designs are that are still on the table at that time, and you start making pictures out of them, it really, really comes much more clear to the people who choose to attend the meeting or look at the materials online. And so it's our hope we could take advantage of that technology, which has worked well for us in other communities. I also mentioned that we would hope to do a couple of surveys, and it was our thought that at the 1st and 2nd meeting, we may try to arrange our meeting so that we can ask the whole attendees, as well as people who choose to go online later, certain set of questions, and we could get feedback maybe through iPhones. I've worked with that in other communities, and it's very fun to have that feedback in real time, and we can see how people's take people's temperature while it's happening, and then also leave that available online for people to weigh in the same similar time frame. We would propose that the 2nd meeting have a similar sort of online survey component, as well as potentially something live when we do that meeting. The 2nd meeting we're targeting in October, and the 3rd meeting would need to be in November to hit our target date of a December council recommendation. So we also have a few other additional outreach tools. We, of course, would be creating a project fact sheet. This is really something that will probably use that graphic that I showed you earlier, as well as where people can go to get more information and a bit about the project and what it's covering physically, what are the areas that are under consideration, et cetera. And these we would expect to update as meetings occur and information becomes more narrowed down. We would be continuing to keep the project fact sheet up to date. We would, of course, be doing meeting notices and using the excellent already existing city network of getting the word out about your meetings, such as using Nextdoor, the city's Twitter and Facebook accounts, your Gov Delivery program, et cetera. We'll also be reaching out to the Friends of Caltrain blog, the CARD blog, Stanford, the Palo Alto Weekly, et cetera. We really want people to attend the meetings if they can. Once they're at the meeting, we'll be asking people to sign in, and we'll also be taking not only live feedback, but comment cards at all the meetings so that we capture everything we can possibly capture. And one interesting thing to note is that the webpage, while linked from both the Caltrain website and the city's website, would actually be hosted by the AECom folks, and the reason for that is so that we can have perhaps richer and deeper and more interactive graphics, which may be beyond what some of our government hosts are able to accommodate. So that's why you see that webpage hosted on the AECom website. I've already mentioned the 2 surveys. I should also mention that there's 4 project mailings. The current thinking is that maybe the first one might be a modified version of the fact sheet, just to get everyone who might see that through the networking of the distribution that we're back in business and when things are going to happen, and the new outreach process. And then we're thinking that maybe the second and third might be some sort of push out to the broader community who maybe didn't attend the community meetings to take advantage of the online surveys. And then our current thinking is the fourth and last community project mailing would probably be something that made whatever the preferred solution moving forward very obvious and known to the broader public. And so that's the thinking of that. We will, of course, be keeping the database up to current standards. So as people utilize any way to get us that they'd like to be added to it, we'll be working with the city to do that. And then there is a project hotline, which is really a phone number that would go to City Hall, and then they would take those calls and questions, and the AECom team would stand ready to help answer that from both a project technical side as well as just potentially some help in just writing the message back. And then finally, and then I'm happy to take questions, there is a part of this which would be a summary report at the very end, and the reason for that is to capture all of this outreach and what happened and when meetings were held and how many people attended and what the meeting summaries in summary said, so that when this project moves to the next phase, whoever picks it up then would have a nice record of what happened during this phase of the project. And with that, I'm complete with my presentation.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Has Councilmember Tanaka called in? No. All right. So let me come back to council. And do we have any public speakers? 2? I don't have them on the screen, but. Well, anyway, now we'll go to the public, and we have 2 public speakers. So Stephen Rosenblum and Penny Ellison.
Good evening, council members. My name is Steve Rosenblum. I live on Santa Rita Avenue near the California Avenue Caltrain station. The most important part of the decision-making process for this important and large rails grade separation project is an effective public outreach process. This document is a good start in that direction as it lays out the objectives and intentions of this process in a clear fashion. However, as in all such projects, the actual process must be carried out in such a fashion as to embody these intentions. In that spirit, I'd like to offer a few comments. The first is I'd like a clarification on the relationship between our consultant, AECom, and Apex Strategies. I see both names on the documents, and I'd like to understand their separate roles in the process better. Secondly, I applaud the idea of a community advisory panel, CAP, that would make some, and like to make some suggestions about it. I do not think it is a good idea for the city manager to pick the 12 members of this panel by himself. This panel is supposed to represent the community members and should be chosen either by city council members or in collaboration with the city manager. In addition, it is important that the CAP have very close interaction with the technical advisory committee in order that the technical questions of the CAP can be answered quickly and correctly at the time they are raised, without waiting for answers between meetings. Since both of these groups will be meeting the same number of times, it should not be a problem to arrange the timing so they occur together. TAC members could arrange to meet separately before or after the CAP meetings if necessary. If the CAP does its job well, the rest of the outreach process should move efficiently to a successful conclusion. If not, dissension and acrimony will result, pitting one stakeholder group against another, an undesirable outcome for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Penny Ellison?
Good evening. I'm Penny Ellison, speaking as an individual. First, I want to thank you for the long hours. I know you all have been working lately on our behalf. I have noticed that, and I am grateful. I'd like to suggest that the Community Engagement Plan stakeholder group should include some representatives who were not included on the staff report list. They are a representative from Palo Alto Unified School District, who owns the largest property abutting the Churchill Crossing. Maybe the new superintendent or Bob Golton might suggest someone from the district's bond measure staff who has very intimate familiarity with current and planned school site constraints. The original guidelines for the Connecting Palo Alto process directed staff to ensure that grade separations would provide facilities for all modes of transportation. But neither the PTA Council Traffic Safety Committee nor Payback is represented on the stakeholder group as it's written up now. Please consider including a rep from the Palo Alto Council of PTA's Traffic Safety Committee, or at minimum, a Pali PTA rep to be invited to this committee. If council opts to close Churchill, I think a Hayes Elementary School rep might be invited as well. Embarcadero traffic is a sensitive issue for that school, as you've recently seen, and the addition of thousands of new trips to Embarcadero may be of concern to them. And finally, I'm interested in hearing what criteria will be used to select the neighborhood leader representatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Neva Yarkin?
Neva Yarkin. I just have a comment. When AECOM was talking about the survey and the lifetime, I think in iPhones and lifetime. So I think you need to include everyone in the process, young, old. A lot of people don't, some people don't have iPhones. Some people don't know how to work them. And I think that's crucial that their voices be heard. Thank you.
And that concludes our public speakers on this item. Did staff want to respond to any of the questions asked by the public speakers? Was there anything in particular? I mean,
We definitely can cover the Apex AECOM relationship. Etty?
So the AECOM team is comprised of a few subconsultants, of which Apex is one of our subconsultants. And Apex is going to be primarily, with Eileen in charge or leading the public outreach community. And AECOM is going to be primarily with, providing the technical information that goes into evaluating the alternatives, along with some other subconsultants that include traffic, bike and ped planning, as well as landscape architecture.
all right, thank you. And now we'll return to the council. The Rail Committee Chair.
Thank you for the updated report, and thank you for having listened to our feedback and our concerns and questions from last week, both the committee and those from the public, including addressing the question of time of day to make sure that parents of school-age kids could participate. There was also a question about how members of or representatives of neighborhoods might be chosen. I know you're still getting to know the community, but do you have any thoughts at this point about how that will be done?
I'm going to defer to Rob on this one.
Yeah, and I can begin, and I'm sure Jim will like to add to this. Rob DeGose, City Manager's Office. One thing that'll be, I think we've talked about before here, we've been meeting with sort of what we're calling highly engaged citizens that have been following this process from the beginning over the last 2 months in small group meetings, 4 or 5, so we can really have a conversation. We've probably had 30 or so people that we've met with, a number of the people that you see behind you here. So, I think some of those folks will be part of the 12. We're looking for representatives from the different organized groups. You know about a number of them that have self-organized around the topic of grade separation. So we would like to have representation from them. We certainly are interested in hearing from neighborhoods across the community. So that's both south and north, but also east and west sides of the rail line. I think we need to hear from each of those, so they need to be represented. And then you heard it from Penny Ellison, but the Safe Routes to School, school district, PTA, some representation from those stakeholders. And there may be a couple of others. I think it's fair to say that nobody will be happy with 12, right? That we'll have exactly the right 12. But we've been working on this for some time, and I think the city manager will find a good group of 12 individuals that have been engaged, have some knowledge of this challenge, and I think it'll be very helpful to this process that we're working on.
Thank you.
I think Jim also wanted to weigh in.
Well, was that sufficient? I mean,
If you have additional thoughts you'd like to share, especially since we have two
Well,
members of council who were not
again,
part of the
I mean, I
committee.
think the idea over the last couple of discussions has been to have a group that is right-sized to both, dive deep enough that would have members who are, and Rob used the terms, highly engaged and knowledgeable. Maybe that we actually do some interviews. Close to half of them are from this organized sort of citizen group, 4 or 5, whatever it is, from the approximate residents, which I think is a particularly key factor. I do think that in one of the discussions we had earlier about how we set this group up is we don't necessarily want to get in a situation where we have to recuse somebody from participating because they're within boundaries that, if we didn't constitute this accurately, people like that could be recused from participating, and that seemed to be worthwhile to get that representation. And then, whether it's someone from business schools or students, that's it. I think it's just important to remember that there are a lot of parallel streams of engagement that are taking place, of which this is just one. And secondly, if somebody is not chosen to be formally in this group, that doesn't preclude their participation. It doesn't preclude their speaking before the council all through this entire process. And I'm sure that there will be people, who will do that. So this is not like this is you win the prize if you get on this this group. And one of the things on the recusal area, in a general sense, and Molly could maybe help me, is that to the extent that this group moves beyond sort of advisory to really sort of distinctly and almost, I don't want to say singularly, but shapes particular recommendations that get adopted by the council, that starts to move into a territory where people could be excluded from participation.
For legal reasons.
For good reasons, yes. So the
for
reason that
legal
there's only
reasons.
seven council members up here, because we're working through this issue, and in the end, it is the city council's going to have to make these decisions. So what we want is to have enough channels and streams of information and feedback in a way that ultimately lets you all freely reconcile, all of the different, again, themes and streams that we've put forward. So in that sense, I think it would be helpful to think about the approach we're using as different than some of our other planning processes, and because we're also pointing towards some very specific decisions that need to be made here, not just simply a plan. Thanks.
I appreciate that. And I think that that's actually really helpful as a reminder about how we're moving forward and how staff will go about comprising this group, one of several groups and one of several mechanisms for us to get input and for staff, the consultants, to get input from the community. I just want to be really clear about this. If we were to assign to this group, empower this group to be basically the decision recommending body, that would mean that a lot of the people who we want on this group would be legally prohibited from participating. It's a bit of a catch-22, and so that's why I think it's important to move forward with a process where we allow greater opportunity to have people who may be affected weigh in through this kind of a mechanism, and I think this is the right way to do it. So with that, I'll offer a motion, which is I want to say the staff recommendation, but it's really the recommendation from the Rail Committee. I'll put it out there, and of course we can have conversation. I know that two members, both Councilmember Du Bois and Councilmember Holman, will probably want to ask a lot of questions and may have other thoughts, and I would definitely welcome those since they were not part of the conversation last week. And I'm glad that Councilmember Du Bois is able to participate in this conversation. I'm glad that we got the go-ahead from the FPPC to make sure that he's able to join us for these discussions.
All right, I'll second your motion. You want to speak further?
Just briefly, just to say that I appreciate staff and consultants moving quickly to start putting together the outlines of this plan to bring this to us and endeavoring to not waste the summer, to start digging into the details of how these various groups will be comprised, and to move forward with the plan to get more people talking about this. And also say, I think that a lot of people in Palo Alto still have no idea that we're dealing with this. A lot of people in Palo Alto have no idea what's going on, and the first they hear about it is sometimes a very scary thing that they might hear. And sometimes legitimately scary, and sometimes maybe they're confused or they're not getting the whole story. And so having us start really getting out there and bring people in a more comprehensive way, I think will help bring the community up to speed on where we're at in this process, how important it is that we continue the process towards ultimately making decisions, and let people know that there are still a lot of opportunities for their voices to be heard and for their concerns to be addressed. Ultimately, and we'll talk about this probably a little bit in item 2, ultimately, we're going to have to make some compromises. Right? We are going to have, we know we have several values that are at play here, and some of them, if we stuck to one 100%, it would sacrifice another, and so we're going to have to weigh those various concerns. And I think that that's true with the community engagement as well, right? You talk about right sizing, right? The bigger a group is, the less efficient it can be, but if it's too small, then it's not representative. And so it really is about trying to find the right size, the right path, kind of the middle way. So I do appreciate this plan, and I think that the way you've laid it out in this report is very helpful for us.
I'll just speak briefly to the second. I think, as I said at the Rail Committee, I think you guys put together a really solid plan. It's a good plan. And just to be clear, this is the plan that you came up with, that the Rail Committee then blessed, but we didn't actually make any changes to it, is my recollection. So it's really recommended by staff and then recommended by the Rail Committee as well. So thank you for that hard work, and hope we'll support it. Councilmember Koo.
I agree, it's a great plan, but I do have some questions regarding, so I'm glad that Neva Yarkin talked about the survey and the iPhone tool, the high-tech thing. Are you going to be able to have an opportunity for a table maybe at the back of the room or something for people who don't use these kind of devices to be able to also communicate?
When I've done this in the past, and the AECOM team has folks that'll be at the meeting helping to staff it. I've had situations where we've just buddied up and used our own phones and voted on behalf of those folks, and it's worked out great. And especially in a community like this, we do want to make that available. I certainly hear what your public person mentioned, and we have run into it, and there's ways to do that. So we'll be very sensitive to that.
I've run into it too, trying to set it up and getting fumbly with my thumbs and everything, so it does happen. Let me see. And I see you've set up the first meeting. There's no way for it to be end of July or something, even earlier. You need all that time towards to the end of August in order to put it on.
Yeah, and the reason for the public meeting being at the end of August is that ET's engineering team is still working to get the materials ready. I know you've got another agenda item where we're still talking about what's still around to be talked about in August, so we're going to need some time to get our materials ready and the graphics, because again, I think one of the best things that we're most proud of working together is that we've got great graphics that help really tell the story. So we don't want to rush something at the expense of just throwing out something that isn't really usable in the long term. So we want to make sure that we've got the best possible quality quality, and that frankly, all of the alternatives or scenarios or whatever we're going to call these, are very equal in their graphics, because some of them have been around longer than others, and so we want to make sure that we don't by accident create a bias.
Okay, that's very good. So help me see the timeline, the CAP, the interviews. When do you expect that to happen? Before the community meeting first? Before the first community meeting?
In
So
my
kinda
ideal
run me
world,
through
we would
that.
have the community advisory panel seated in July, and we would have our first kickoff meeting and talk about what they want to talk about, create, we would come in with a draft work plan, a framework, and take feedback on that, et cetera. And then again, in my perfect world, then prior to the August 23rd meeting, we would have our second community advisory panel, because I would love for them to see the graphics and see the PowerPoint and kind of hear and the tempo and how we're going to arrange the room and all those good things, because that's part of their role, is they need to give us feedback and we need to answer questions. So it's an exchange of information, and so for that to really work best, it would be great to have a kickoff meeting and then the meeting that's really focused on the first community meeting, and we would time the community advisory panel to always be meeting prior to whatever our public meeting is, to use them as, as canaries, if you will, to help us.
So how would the rail committee meeting fit into this timeline from the community? I just want to make sure when we have our rail committee or council meetings on rail, that we have community input on that topic also. So they're heard first before it comes to us, so we get the full picture.
So I think, again, this sort of railroad track chart anticipates there being rail committees concurrent with the time frame on the community panel, advisory panel. And again, I would say other ways that these larger community meetings take place, where you're going to potentially even hear from more folks. If you're asking specifically, how would we sequence them, like, this day versus that day, we'll take that under advisement. We certainly understand the value of you being able to sort of be sure you're as up to date as possible with where the community is. So.
Thank you.
I would just add, Councilmember Koo, that a more detailed calendar of the different meetings, because there are a lot that we're trying to accomplish in this 6 months, so I can appreciate how important that sequencing will be. And just to build on what Eileen said about the importance of the citizen advisory panel, I'm excited about having that as part of this process, because frankly, we need it. We need the citizens to help us get the word out as much as us hearing from them about the different meetings that are coming up.
So I'm glad that you brought up that you need the citizens the residents to help you take the word out, et cetera. So I was noticing, I'm hoping that you would also reach out to PAN, Palo Alto Neighborhoods, and then who's the umbrella group for most of the neighborhood associations. And also, in addition to PAN, also reach out to some of the neighborhood associations that are more involved and have more, that are kind of up and running and very involved in city affairs or in their neighborhoods. I think they're going to be able to get the word out. Yes, sir.
Yeah, and so I would say, hopefully we're going to have a chance to do some interviews if possible. And, to the extent if we end up choosing someone or not choosing somebody, that doesn't mean that we wouldn't want to keep them connected and engaged in some other ways.
No, I understand. So what Penny Elson said about PAUSD and PTA as stakeholders, is that part of the plan? Or
The PTAs?
I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. School groups, the property owners, all of that could be part of a stakeholder meeting, or if it's appropriate, having a representative, which I believe was what her hope was, that a representative representing that part of the world in that specific school district would be actually sitting on the CAP. So somehow, definitely, and I wrote it down, that we need to make those linkages happen.
And you'd evaluate,
and maybe all of the above.
You'd evaluate which the stakeholders or the CAP is the better place for them.
Yeah.
So having them represented there, I think, is going to be important in the school district in one way or another. And they are also represented on the technical advisory committee.
Oh,
So
they
I just
are.
wanted to be sure.
Okay.
Yeah, you knew that, yeah.
Thank you.
Councilmember Du Bois?
Yeah, it's nice to meet you. Is your name Ellen? Or-
Eileen.
Eileen, okay. Well, welcome aboard.
Thank you.
So it sounds like there was some discussion already about concern with smartphone polling, or, yeah, we did it last year. I would say there was definitely consternation about people not having
Okay,
phones.
good feedback.
And I also think you got to ask questions carefully. I think people felt a little bit led by kind of multiple choice questions that they wanted to express something else, so.
There are some technologies where you can actually hand out a clicker, so that might be something we could look into just to
Right.
even that up.
But also making it clear if the data is not going to be used for anything or how
yeah.
it would be used. So I was thinking about community outreach. So in 2016, I think we had 5 rail meetings. Last year we had 13 rail meetings. We did 6 community meetings. I think we reached about 600 people. And at the end of last year, we modified the rail charter to say we were going to start meeting more often and doing more outreach. So I think it's great to see this plan. It's about time because we're getting to a part of the process where we kind of slowed down. I think we've had like 4 rail meetings this year. And I also really like to see the schedule go on beyond November of 2018. And it's really great to see it coming back to council more often. I think it's really of importance where it should. And we should really start to think about, kind of like we did with the comp plan, what's the overall schedule? That's not going to stop in November. So do you intend, and this is for staff or Eileen either, that the members of the CAP are residents of Palo Alto?
I think, yes. But there might be some situation where there was a connection where one individual is not, I mean, not that we have anybody in mind. I wouldn't want to say absolutely that if, we had somebody who had that knowledge, the technical expertise, and had another connection, that we would absolutely preclude that person. But I mean, that would be a very, very small minority.
I mean, I think the CAP should be residents. I think you could have a stakeholder who's not, clearly. I really would like a little more fleshing out of criteria for membership. I think it sounds like this is the intent, but really finding people who represent a group of interested people that they can go back and report and kind of magnify discussion. I mean, if you just think about the neighborhoods along the track, it's Ventura, Evergreen Park, Southgate, Midtown, Old Palo Alto, Downtown North and South, Charleston Meadows, Monroe Park, Fair Meadows, south of Midtown. So that's 12 neighborhoods right there. Well, Professorville. So it really reaches a lot of the city. I don't think we can lose sight of that. And I think there's going to be interest from a lot of neighborhood groups. I agree with the comments on the stakeholder group that definitely PAUSD should be included. I didn't see the business park on the list. I think they should probably be included as a stakeholder. And so I'm a little bit concerned, this CAP, I mean, what are they responsible for? Are they going to be producing recommendations?
I think the way that it's currently envisioned is that it's an exchange of information and not necessarily empowered to make a specific recommendation or a vote or any of that type of the way it would be run. So it's to hear voices, get questions answered, and as you pointed out, magnify the information back. That doesn't mean that they couldn't, and I'll defer to the city staff, but right now the way I was thinking about it is it would be more an exchange of information rather than a formal body that would make a vote on something that would then be advisory to the council, because we've set it up to be advisory to the committee, to this project team and the city staff.
And if we can restate why that is, because it's, without understanding the context for it, it could seem like, well, why are we being so obtuse or whatever about this? And this is the fact that, and Molly can weigh in, if we cross a boundary where these representatives are empowered and entrusted with making recommendations that formally make up a specific amount, whatever it is, of the decisions that the council ultimately makes, then we trigger the potential for this conflict and recusal issue. So we're trying to walk this line between allowing people who in some ways could be the most impacted, or certainly some of the most impacted. I think it's a mistake to assume that there aren't people all over the city who are affected by this project. I mean, we could redirect traffic patterns in some way that could really disrupt someone's lives who are not right nearby. But we want to ensure that we have that ability to not exclude people based on geography if they bring other pieces to that. And so I think as we're going to sort of navigate that conversation and how feedback is formalized, and be honest with you, with some of the help of the city attorney's office as we're there, so that we're able to keep the committee involved and engaged, but we also don't need to then sort of end up with a bunch of recusals from members of the committee because we're moving into territory. I think in the end, the council and the city will benefit from all of the information and the input in the right way. We just need to make sure that we process it right. So I know it sounds like we're really sort of splitting hairs or threading the needle or whatever, but it really is one of those situations where we're trying to say we want to have engagement of representative and effective people without eliminating key representation. And that means we're going to manage the form that the comments and feedback come back to us, to the council, carefully.
So I appreciate that explanation. I have a little bit of concern of how that's going to play out. I think if people are just being asked to kind of broadcast a message, you're going to get maybe a certain type of participation and maybe frustration, but hopefully people will be able to get feedback.
We're not asking them just to broadcast.
Yep.
We're asking them to advise the consultant team and the staff who you have empowered to really bring back the unfolding of a series of recommendations. And I think we just need to understand that we need to assimilate it in that process in order to allow key voices to actually be able to be heard. I would guess at the end of the day, it would be very interesting, Molly'd have to weigh in on this, if some people were so disappointed that somehow their participation had been so filtered out that they may have some other vehicle ultimately that they can make that commentary, but not so much in their formal role as on the committee. I don't know what that means, but you'll have to help us with that. So again, you have to choose representation and trust over how we will communicate that, or preclude representation, you know what I mean, and reconstitute it. You can't have it both. We can't have it both ways.
So I do see a lot of concern on next door chatter there. I do think you should consider slowing down just a bit, making sure you get off to a good start with this first meeting. In the description of community meeting 1, you say you'll discuss the 10 alternatives, and I think that's right. I think you should start broad, and even allow some modifications to those alternatives if that's where people want to go. And then just overall, I think it's really important that we get this right rather than drive to a schedule. We've tried that on other projects. It usually backfires on us. So, thank you.
Councilmember Holman?
Yes, thank you. And nice to have you here.
Thank you.
There's pretty much nothing that Councilmember DuBois said that I would take issue with. So let me double down on his comments. A few other things is if I look at and there aren't numbers on the slide, so it's a little bit hard to point to them, but the one that has stakeholder meetings as the title on it. I think Councilmember Koo actually asked this, Palo Alto neighborhood leaders and/or similar organized specific tasks. That runs together, sorry. Palo Alto neighborhood leaders and/or similar organized groups, organizations, probably I should say. Yeah, and then it has a run into something else. So there is the group PAN that Councilmember Koo referenced, but do understand that not all neighborhoods have organized neighborhood organizations. So I think what Councilmember Du Bois did in listing the neighborhoods that are along the tracks, I agree with the city manager that, you know, people citywide can be affected by what's going on, but who's going to be more interested than people that are really closer to this and going to be appreciating the impacts of that. One other question on the stakeholder groups, organizations is Leadership Palo Alto. And I don't really understand why that's there because I am pretty darn certain that they don't even convene with their new class until September's of each year. So they're just going to be getting going in September after this commences. And while some people there are involved, it really is for people who want to get more involved and informed about our town. So I'm not really sure that that's a fertile field, if you will, both in terms of timing and at least a fair amount of the membership of that. And hey, I'm an alum of it, so I'm not criticizing it whatsoever. I also don't see business and property owners there. The Palo Alto Chamber of Commerce is there, but the Chamber of Commerce certainly does not represent all business owners and property owners, and be sensitive to that, I would say. And it's always seemed to me, and this could be right or wrong, it's always seemed to me that the concentration of membership there is also downtown more than California Avenue, but California Avenue is, so, and the California Avenue Business Association, I guess I would say reach out broader than that organization because it tends to be concentrated in a few people that are dedicated and active, but a broader collection of input from other businesses and property owners there would be well advised, I think. I am more than delighted that you're going to have graphics and 3D representations because I think that's, I've said before here, so I think that's something that's been really lacking, really, really lacking. People don't visualize, you know, from little rail drawings and engineers' drawings. So I am more than delighted and look forward to seeing those. The surveys are very tricky. Surveys are very tricky. They're at a minimum an art, at a minimum. So I don't know if you can respond to how, actually I think Councilmember Du Bois said something about it on Tuesday, how is it that the surveys aren't going to be leading? Because it is very easy to fall into that. So how are they going to be really eliciting true input as opposed to leading someone to a conclusion? Is there what's your approach to that? And I don't mean for you to give us a doctoral on that, but it's something that I think the community is really concerned about.
That's a great question.
And not because of you, just
Thank
kind
you.
of
No,
because surveys are very, very difficult.
Right. Well, the first thing, I guess I cringe a bit at the term survey, which I know I used because it's in our scope. Because for me, a survey really does imply something that's scientific and has been done like a poll for an elected, you know, an issue that's going before the voters where it would be representative.
Polls can also be leading to those.
They certainly can. So I'm just talking about the universe because in my experience in public works projects where you use a survey, you're getting people who are very motivated, who already care, and who are not the general public. So first thing first, anything we would get through this feedback mechanism, which I'll call that, is going to be just what that is. Whoever chose to give us feedback, that's what it was. And the second thing is the kind of survey questions I think we are looking at, Etty and I have talked about, is really related to design elements. And so it's more of a, do you like this or do you like that? Or do you have no opinion on this? It's not some sort of philosophical, at least at this point in our thinking. It's more, do you like, there might be 4 or 5 different ways a retaining wall might be done. And getting some just gut reaction of, we like it like this, we don't like it like that, we hate chain link fence, we like palm trees, we hate palm trees. It's, I mean, I'm simplifying it here, but it would be over probably pictures or things that would be related to the engineering part of the project. In my mind, this is not these surveys that would be held at the meeting where we would have clickers or iPhones or pieces of paper in the back or however they were done, is really about what's being presented and some online version of it. It's not intended to talk about philosophical things or put out theories that either are pro or con or something like that. At least that's not our thinking to date. And it really probably wouldn't go too deep if there was, for example, a question about funding. I think that's where there could be some concerns and some issues, and if we asked it, it would have to be in a pretty straightforward way so that we wouldn't be accused of trying to lead people, because quite frankly, the engineering team, we don't have a point of view. So about that, we're trying to be transparent and get feedback on the work we're doing. Okay. I hope that answers it.
It does. It's very helpful. So 2 or 3 things just about that. The first thing, are we going to build 5 sample walls and then, so.
Maybe.
So you got that. So, but in terms of funding, so will there be an open-ended opportunity too? Because we haven't heard it yet, but perhaps there's a very creative avenue to some funding source or some funding. So will be an open-ended opportunity to respond to that.
Well, I do think, and we have talked as the whole city team as well as the project team about how do we address the issues related to funding, because they certainly could potentially constrain what's really, you know, going to move forward or not. And so at some point that conversation needs to happen, and whether that's part of a survey that happens right then and there, or it's more of work that's done that the city is already doing on some other surveying that's been done citywide and that sort of thing. I think there's absolutely going to be in all the meetings some conversation about how do things get funded, what are appropriate ways to fund things, what are best practices in funding large capital projects, where's the appetite to learn more about some of that. I think all of that should and will come out of the next 6 months, because it's definitely a topic.
Okay, and I think just a couple more questions. Thank you very much. In the presentation, it talked about 3 to 5:30 p.m. meetings, and there'd been pushback about that. And I thought you said that there'd been a suggestion that AM meetings were more likely, but then I saw somewhere else where there were like evening meetings, so I'm a little bit
So I think the community meetings are definitely evening meetings, and the hope and thought right now, especially if we're going to be trying to combine or have our technical people be there, they really need to be during the day with this community group.
Okay, and the meetings will be broadcast, recorded, posted?
We haven't addressed that yet, so I don't know what your typical.
Yeah, I think we'll certainly try and do that, Councilmember Holman, and they'll be open to the public to view, certainly, and we'll talk with the media center to see how they can be taped so people can review them.
Yeah, it'd be great if the meetings could be recorded and posted, and I think it's actually, I think it'd be well advised, really well advised, to do that. And that may be my questions. Let me just double check here. Oh, I know what the other question was, is feedback, and there are 2 reasons for this. Feedback would not be anonymous. Surveys would not be anonymous. It's a question.
Well, if we're doing them live at the meeting, they'd be clicker or whatever, and we wouldn't be capturing that information, I don't believe. I mean, we haven't landed on a technology, so I can't completely answer that question, but it's not our intent.
I should have refined it. I mean, like online and, stuff that you're collecting outside of a meeting, that would be attributable?
I don't think anything would be, at this point, we're not planning, because we're not really, quite frankly, scoped to have open-ended questions online for that survey. So it would be, I like B, I like green, I like 6, I like whatever. And it would probably be somehow limited, although we haven't talked about it, to one survey filling per IP, per computer or per email address. But again, it's not our intent to go back. We don't have the need to do that, nor the desire to go back and try and link up your particular computer, or you like bunnies, or whatever your email address is, to how somebody answered some of these more basic questions. It's not our intent. So yeah, they would be, I guess, from your definition, anonymous, although by the very nature of it, somehow it probably would be screened, and so that somebody couldn't go on and do it 400 times is the point.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If we could vote on the board, seeing no other lights. And that passes unanimously with Council Members Tanaka absent and Councilmember Councilmember Niss and Councilmember Filsath recused.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And now on to the next item, which is item number 2.
Good evening, council members. I'm Josh Mello, the Chief Transportation Official. Tonight, we're going to receive a presentation from Eddie Mercurio, the project manager from AECOM, regarding our narrowing of some of the ideas that have been developed for the various grade crossing locations. If you remember the last time we visited, we presented a recommendation from the Rail Committee to narrow the master list of 35 ideas down to 10 ideas, and you approved that narrowing with some caveats, and a lot of those were driven by the public comments that we received that evening regarding some of the potential impacts of the hybrid ideas at Churchill in particular. So since that meeting, we have directed Eddie and her team to do a little bit of a deeper dive on 3 of the ideas, the first of which is the Palo Alto Avenue hybrid, PAH, and then the other 2 are the hybrids at Churchill Avenue, the traditional hybrid as well as the reverse hybrid. This is not a full-blown alternatives analysis, which we will reserve for the shorter list of alternatives that we're hoping to get to shortly. This is just a very preliminary look at some of the potential constraints. We presented this to the Rail Committee last week, and the recommendation from the Rail Committee is included in your packet, and it's also displayed on the screen up above. Eddie's going to go over the same presentation that the Rail Committee received with some additions that were recommended by some of the committees of the members of the Rail Committee to further clarify some of the work that was done. So with that, I'll turn this over to Eddie to go through the presentation.
All right, thank you, and good evening. As Josh mentioned, this is a list that was presented to council on the May 29th, and we'll be looking at just the 3 ideas that he just mentioned. I'll quickly go over them. The first one that I'll be going through is the Churchill hybrid, where the road is lowered and the rail is raised. The second one I'll be going over is the Churchill reverse hybrid, which is the reverse of that, where the rail is lowered and the road is raised. And then look at Palo Alto, the hybrid, where the road is lowered and the rail is raised. Just to kind of set this up, I'll go through the exhibits of how we come up with the rail profile, and then move to the roadway profile and kind of go through the initial impact analysis of that. And as Josh had mentioned, this is a very high-level engineering study. This is not the level of detail that we will go into at, as Eileen brought up, at the August community outreach meeting. So this first slide here is an aerial view of the city. On the left-hand side, which is to the north, is bounded by the Embarcadero Underpass. And on the right-hand side of this slide, let me see if the mouse, I'm the mouse challenge. In this area is the California Avenue Caltrain platform. Those are kind of major constraints for this particular alternative. And that basically defines how quickly we can raise the rail profile up with those two constraints in those locations. The other constraint I want to mention is the Caltrain is a operating commuter rail, and so we have to be very cognizant of how we can construct a project of a grade separation while keeping a commuter rail in service. And so we have the constraint of making sure that we maintain that operational envelope, and that sets how far off a shoe fly, which is the temporary rail alignment that we push for the rail, how far that gets offset, and then that also comes into the factor of the impacts. So going to this graphic here, the yellow line through this slide, this graphic here represents the existing Caltrain alignment, the tracks. The blue square here is the Caltrain California platform, and then this diagonal line represents the Embarcadero Underpass roadway. The red line is basically the length of rail that will be raised coming off the California platform. We have to start the shoe fly a little bit farther south, and the red line represents the portion of raised railroad, which is on the order, I've got to get my glasses on to look at this one, on the order of about 3,800 feet. We're coming off the Caltrain platform. We'll be raising it at a 1% grade, which is what the Caltrain criteria allows. And by the time we get to Churchill, the railroad is raised approximately 10 feet. And at that point, we'll be able to lower it down. We can go down at about a 0.6 grade, and we get the rail profile to match the existing profile before the Embarcadero Underpass. For the vertical clearance, when a roadway is below a railroad structure, the Caltrain criteria is that we have to have 15.5 vertical clearance. That's the distance from the top of road to the bottom of a railroad structure. And for the purposes of this evaluation, we assume that the structure depth is about 5 feet. So with that in mind, that means if the railroad top of rail is 10 feet above the existing grade, that means we have to excavate down the roadway approximately 12 to 15 feet to get that vertical clearance for the roadway. So, it's not moving?
It's slow.
Oh,
Oh, you need to do this one.
I did that one. Oh, there we go. I didn't press hard enough. So this is the roadway profile impacts. The purple outline basically are the limits of the roadway construction, where the edge of this profile on each one of these roads is basically where we start the lowering of the roadway, and by the time you get to the railroad tracks, you would be at the maximum lowered depth. For the purposes of this analysis, we are looking at about a 7.4% grade down on Churchill, and then another as you rise up at the same grade. And that's at a 25 mile per hour design speed. And at Alma and the Mariposa were looked at 5% grades, with Alma at a 35 mile per hour design speed. Oh, yes.
On your chart, when you say plus 7.4%, that's going down.
Yes.
And when you do minus, it's going up.
Yeah, so I'm looking from left to right, from my engineering drawing. So as we're going down, that's a minus one, and then as you raise up, that's a plus percentage.
Oh, okay, the other way. I get it. Thank you.
Yeah. So just to kind of point out the impacts for the initial review of impacts is that there's trees between Alma Street and the mainline tracks. Those would have to be removed for the construction of the shoe fly. We have, because of the shoe fly, we'd have a temporary reduction in the width of Alma Street, whereby we'd probably have some limitations on parking as well as, but we'd still be able to maintain at least 2 lanes of traffic, 1 in each direction. There are approximately 22 residential properties that are impacted with this engineering alternative. And then we also have utility relocations, because in the roadway we have existing utilities in both Churchill, Alma, and Mariposa. And finally, there is a visual impact because the railroad is raised about 10 feet maximum at Churchill. So similarly, okay, it doesn't like, all right. Let's see, maybe it's, oh. Okay, I can use the roller. Oh, thank you. So similarly, we looked at what we call the reverse hybrid. So a lot of the same thoughts were going into that. We have the Embarcadero on the north side, which is our constraint. We have the California Station on the south side, which is another constraint. And we have the Caltrain operating railroad. So starting from the south end, like Caltrain operating railroad, we start the shoe fly out, and then our construction for the lowered railroad starts a little bit south of the platform. And we would have approximately 3,600 linear feet of lowered railroad track. What this means is we come off the grade here is basically dictated where I'm going to go from the north side, from Embarcadero. We start lowering at 1%. When we get to Churchill, the rail is lowered about 6 feet. And the big difference here between the other hybrid is that the vertical clearance required from the top of rail to the bottom of the roadway structure is 24.5 feet under Caltrain criteria, but I'd like to point out under high-speed rail criteria, they require 27 feet. For the purposes of this study, we use the 24.5 feet with the structure depth. So what this means is that with the rail down at 6 feet and including our structure depth for the roadway, we'd have the roadway up at about 22 feet above the existing grade where it is today. Oh, do the roller. Oops. So this is the representation of the roadway, elevated roadway above a lowered track. The purple area is the length of roadway construction that would occur under this idea, where again the conforms are where we start to lower roadways are at these limits of the purple shading. In this particular case, again, we were looking at a 25 mile per hour design speed on the local roads and 35 on Alma. Here we just looked at an 8% grade on Churchill going down and a 8% grade up. Again, in this alternative, we have tree from the shoe fly. We have the trees between Alma and the mainline track would get impacted. The Alma Street is also reduced width to accommodate the shoe fly. On this alternative or idea, there's about 46 residential properties impacted. And one of the questions that was brought up at Rail Council was, as I mentioned, we used a 1% as what would happen if we looked at a 2% grade coming up for the rail profile. And we did look at that, and the number of properties reduced impact would go from 46 to 39. So there is some, we bring up the, we lower the railroad about 5 feet additional over the scenario that I'm showing here. We'd also have major utility relocations in the various roadways that are lowered, as well as visual impact, because now you have a roadway that's sitting about 22 feet above the existing grade. Let's see, move. Oops. Okay. So finally, we also were asked to look at the Palo Alto hybrid, and this is the case where the rail is raised and the roadway is lowered. There are a few more constraints in this particular scenario. This is an aerial view of the Palo Alto with Menlo Park on the left-hand side, San Francisco Creek kind of bisecting the middle of the aerial, and then to the south, we have the Palo Alto Caltrain station, as well as the University Avenue underpass. In this particular case, we also have a historic bridge that the current Caltrain service is running over that goes over the creek, so we're looking, and then also there's a heritage tree that's in the Palo Alto Park, and then within Menlo Park we have the Stanford Park Hotel on the west side of the track. So there's a lot of constraints in this particular analysis. So for the purposes of this analysis, we looked at putting, because of the historic bridge there, we're looking at, instead of a shoe fly, that shoe fly serves as the permanent alignment for the track, and then that you would abandon the existing Caltrain tracks in this scenario. This scenario, the red is representing, we're coming off the Palo Alto track at a 1% grade up. Then by Palo Alto, that means that a roadway embankment, embankment is about 7 feet above the existing grade. Again, we have that 15.5 vertical clearance requirement, so that means that our roadway is going to be lowered about 15 feet at Palo Alto. And then we tie back in just north of the creek there within the city limits of Palo Alto. Oops. So similarly, like the other roadway impacts, this is the purple represents the limits of construction for roadway, where on Palo Alto, just a little bit to the east of El Camino Real, we would start to begin the lowering. We looked at a 7% grade here to lower, and by the time you get to the railroad tracks, you have the you're down at the 15-foot excavation. We have an apartment building on the east side, which are the park condominiums. It appears that we'd have to do some further evaluation on the grades and stuff like that, but we may or may not impact their 2 driveways into that parking area. And we looked quickly at putting this alignment on the west side, but it appeared to impact the Stanford Park Hotel, but that would be something more that we need to take a look at as far as evaluating that further. It also appears that the heritage tree with the easterly alignment is although there's some trees that will be impacted in that park, do not impact the heritage tree, but we'd have to do some additional surveys to confirm that, so we know exactly where that heritage tree is relative to a rail alignment. There would be on Alma Street, we have a little bit more buffer there. The Alma Street parking may be permanently impacted with this rail alignment to the east side, and we'd have utility relocations because of the lowering of the roadway, and also some visual impacts because you'd be raising the railroad on this one. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
Thank you, Eddie. With that, I'll defer to the chair of the Rail Committee as to whether you'd like me to read the recommendation from the Rail Committee or if you'd like to do that yourself.
Yeah, actually, why don't you read it just to make sure everybody's
Sure. So the Rail Committee discussed this for quite some time, and the recommendation before you is to eliminate the Churchill Avenue hybrid idea from consideration, eliminate the Churchill Avenue reverse hybrid idea from consideration, break out the Churchill Avenue closure option into full closure and partial closure. So that would be a full-time closure or a part-time closure, or other variations of a closure by mode or time of day. And then remove the language regarding the widening of Embarcadero Road underpass from the description of the Churchill Avenue crossing closure idea, and that is idea CAX. And then finally, add to the Churchill Avenue crossing closure idea, study additional options for addressing traffic in the Embarcadero Road underpass area.
Thank you very much. We have a number of public speakers. I think we have, what, 23? So, yeah. So Dayton Misfeld, to be followed by Carlin Otto.
Yeah, this is the first time I've been in this building. I live on Churchill. I'd like to speak to the closing Churchill, particularly. Churchill was created as a shortcut when the Embarcadero cut across the grid from Middlefield down towards El Camino. It's a relatively narrow street. There are two bike paths, one on each side, primarily used by the students going to school. Parking is only on one side of the street because of the narrow nature. And even if one were to make adjustments to the area proximal to the railroad track, you'd still have a narrow passageway all the way to the Embarcadero turnoff. Excuse me. And at each corner, of course, there's a four-way stop except for Bryant and the bike path activities going from uptown to downtown. Churchill will never be a thoroughfare. It was never created that way. And regardless of what's done next to the railroad tracks, it still won't handle the major problem, which doesn't seem to be addressed at all, which is traffic. And maybe that really is the problem. And I think I have no further comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Carlin Otto, to be followed by Howard Hubin.
Respectfully, council members, the design that we built for this train will be with us for 100 years. We are deciding the future of Palo Alto. And all the designs that you're considering today just continue the same problems we have with our current train. It divides our city, it's noisy, it's dirty, it's dangerous. We should be considering things that get rid of this train, get rid of it just off the top, off above, off above, on the surface, and off short underneath. Get rid of it, put it underground. The tunnel, to me, is the only solution we should even be talking about, because it's going to be 100 years. We're going to be putting more and more people next to the train stations for public transportation. More and more of our residents are going to be affected by the negativity of these designs. So I would like you to imagine a different Palo Alto, and I'm not doing this because I know you can't vote on the tunnel today. I'm asking you to have a dream, a vision for our city. Imagine Palo Alto with no train, no tracks, no barriers, no fences, nothing to divide us from top to bottom, open space, parks, tennis courts, bike paths. Imagine no suicide watches. Imagine silence. Nothing to wake you up in the morning, early when I'm trying to sleep, or late at night. No interrupted conversations. Have to wait for the train to go by. Hold on. Imagine walking and biking from any place in the city across on any street without having to use just the 5 places we're restricted to. And you could make additional car crossings to do the traffic. All I'm asking is have a different vision, please. I will gladly pay $3,000 a year or more in additional taxes for 40 or 50 or 60 years. This is a tiny thousandth of the value of our houses in order to have this improved vision for my city. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Howard Hubin, to be followed by Stephen Rosenblum.
Good afternoon. I believe that a lot of the difficulties that are confronting you here today are based on an imperfect plan about how to make the improvements to the rail separation. I believe it should be done in 2 stages. The first step should be a bridge that takes the railroad at high enough height across Palo Alto. That would open up crossings everywhere in town that you like. And afterwards, the undergrounding could be done. The chute fly or bypass would already exist, and the elevated train during that time, which would greatly reduce the expense and the impact of the undergrounding of the railroad, and then one would come out with the beautiful Palo Alto that was described by the previous speaker. I hope you'll consider other approaches to the situation than these very partial and ugly solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen Rosenblum to be followed by A.
So, Stephen Rosenblum, I live on Santa Rita Avenue. I'd like to happily welcome Councilmember Du Bois back from his recusal. I appreciated his efforts as the chair of the Rail Committee in the past, and I'm sure we can benefit from his wisdom. I'm sorry to say that I completely oppose this motion from the Rail Committee, as it is, I believe, is premature to be winnowing down options without analyzing the associated traffic circulation impacts. Here we have a proposal to close or partially close one rail crossing and fully close another without any consideration of how the excess traffic will be handled by any future crossings. If this motion passes, under most grade separation scenarios, we will be left with only 5 ways for vehicles to cross the tracks, down from 7 today. Where will that traffic go? This premature proposal makes no attempt to address that issue other than some generic statements about studying it. Rather, we should be looking at the rail crossing issue as a way to remake Palo Alto environment to increase east-west connectivity rather than reduce it. Therefore, it is strongly urged the Council to reject this motion, as well as to consider expanding the scope of option MCV, Charleston Meadow Viaduct, to be a citywide viaduct. This option and the citywide tunnel option, WBP, are the only ones that are equitable to all Palo Alto neighborhoods and offer the smallest construction and eminent domain impacts. Please do not make rash decisions without fully considering all the consequences. Otherwise, we will soon be seeing residents from East Meadow and Charleston here complaining about threatened and eminent domain to their homes. Every resident of Palo Alto has skin in this game. Thank you.
So I actually just think it's important to clarify that there is no proposal tonight to close the Palo Alto crossing. It is one of 3 options on the Palo Alto crossing. There's the Palo Alto Avenue hybrid and the Palo Alto Avenue viaduct option. So those 3 options under this motion which we haven't made yet, but which is recommended by the Rail Committee, are all still viable. So I just think it's important to clarify that, because actually the Post did report that. And so I thought people should know that that wasn't part of the motion, because there is some misinformation out there. Thanks. And now we'll move to A, and then Irene Lloyd. I don't know who A is. I just have it on the list here. So maybe we'll move to Irene Lloyd.
Okay. Here I am. I totally agree with people ahead of me. And I'm not on Churchill. Okay. I do not live at Churchill. I live at Charleston, so I'm kind of ahead of him. I'm already here. And I also agree that overhead rail, no, hybrids, homeless, graffitis. Look at that little tunnel we have on California Avenue for pedestrians and bikes. It's dangerous to go under there. It's all dirty and, oh, I can't even mention it. But anyway, you don't want that in Palo Alto or others. What are we supposed to do? Do barbecue parties for the homeless there? Well, they're sleeping under? Well, anyway, I am against totally eminent domain, and I'm all for tunnel. And look how beautiful the city would be, quiet and cleaner area, cleaner air. So that's about all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bartura Hazlitt, to be followed by Yuriko Kishimoto.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Barbara Hazlett, not Bartura. In any event, as I've been here before, I'm a 38-year resident on Emerson Street, right next to Embarcadero. And I'm here in the capacity of representing a number of folks in the Embarcadero and Professorville neighborhoods. As our esteemed former mayor mentioned at the last council meeting, we would be circulating a petition opposing the widening of the Embarcadero underpass and a major concern about the impact on our residential streets as a result of increased traffic and very dangerous speeding. And so we have just started in the last couple days this petition, and I'm happy to report that we have about 100 signatures, and we'll stay after it, but certainly we think that we'll be able to bring you many, many hundreds more. So that is a representation that I wanted to make for a bigger group than myself. I have a couple of things I'd like to say personally. I think it would be good to eliminate the Churchill hybrid ideas. We certainly don't want that kind of eminent domain for our neighbors. I am concerned in this language where you do specifically say that you're going to remove the widening of Embarcadero Road underpass from the description, but then in point E, you go on to say study additional options for addressing traffic in the Embarcadero Road underpass area. We definitely do not want project creep and want it to be emphatic that the widening of the Embarcadero underpass will not be part of that consideration. That's very important to this group. So I feel that to some extent the language in E compromises the statement that was made in your point D. And also, personally, I would like to suggest that we continue to keep Churchill and the Churchill Rail Crossing open so that that can help continue to keep some of the pressure off of Embarcadero. Appreciate your attention.
Thank you. Yuriko Kishimoto, to be followed by Rachel Kellerman.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and honorable council members. As you know, I'm a former mayor. I was the first chair of the Rail Committee, and actually, before the City Council, I was president of the University South neighborhood group as well as other groups. So thank you for your work on these difficult decisions. I'm here to support the petition that Barbara is presenting to you, and also to support the motions made by the Rail Committee. And thank you for making the motion and bringing that forward. I do support the 5 recommendations. As you know, environmental and transportation issues are the reason that got me politically involved in the first place. And what I learned is that you can only win by understanding the big picture and by deliberately making every decision based on a consistent following of that common vision. And in Palo Alto's case, that is the comprehensive plan. So we need a steady reduction in traffic speed, increase in traffic safety, reduction in volume, never an excuse to attract more speeding or more volume. We don't want neighborhoods pitted against the other. So please don't raise the specter of another Oregon Expressway, creating an unacceptable political or physical divide in the city. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Rachel Kellerman, followed by Rob Levitsky.
Good evening, honorable council members and hardworking staff, and hello. Professorville is the oldest neighborhood in Palo Alto. Its narrow streets were not designed as major car commuting arteries or clover leaves to access El Camino Real. Furthermore, streets adjacent to Embarcadero Road serve as vital bicycle and pedestrian routes to schools, libraries, and businesses, and must be protected from harmful car traffic increases. If the Churchill Rail Crossing completely closes, east-west traffic looking to access El Camino and other locations west of the railroad tracks will be pushed into surrounding neighborhood streets as drivers increasingly use navigation apps such as Waze to avoid traffic. During rush hour, Waze-induced gridlock heightens the risk of unsafe driving, imperiling bicyclists, students, and other pedestrians. Palo Alto and other cities all across the country are dealing with the Waze effect and experimenting with solutions. However, thus far, there are no easy or comprehensive solutions to ease Waze-induced commuter traffic that burdens previously quiet neighborhoods. Therefore, we urge city leaders to adopt stronger language for Section E. Add to Churchill Avenue crossing closed CAX idea, study additional options for addressing traffic in the Embarcadero Road underpass area. And, here's the new language, implement appropriate actions to mitigate the impact of redirected traffic onto residential streets in adjacent neighborhoods. Thank you for your time, and I really appreciate how staff has communicated with us when we've contacted you after May 29th, and so I appreciate that communication and look forward to more going forward. Thank you.
I'd like to ask a question of the prior speaker.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Rachel, could you repeat your language, please? Oh, it's in the email that was sent to us. Okay,
We did send it previously.
got it.
Thank you.
Rob Levitsky, to be followed by Patricia.
Hi, Rob Levitsky here. This is a little history lesson here. This is the first overcrossing in Palo Alto of the Palo Alto Avenue, 1864. And this is the first undercrossing. This is the Embarcadero, 1935, being built, and 1936, the opening of the undercrossing. Next one. And this one shows looking towards Town and Country. You can see cars coming in a big group when the signal allows it to come towards the underpass, and then there's a big gap as the signals block it. Another batch of cars comes through, and then a big gap as the signals at Town and Country and Pali prevent the cars from moving. About 900 cars an hour move westbound in the morning on 2 lanes, and actually in the afternoon, 1,200 cars an hour actually make it through 1 lane. So the issue is not so much the fact that there's only 1 lane under Embarcadero. The main thing is that there's these 3 signals that gate all the cars. One way you could solve that is to put a pedestrian overcrossing or undercrossing from Pali to get rid of one of these signals. So that's the Embarcadero issue. What to do at Churchill? Churchill has about 450 cars an hour at peak. So where we've got about 1,200 cars going eastbound in the afternoon on Embarcadero, we've got about a third of that currently going across at Churchill. And that's even with the peak train time with the gates down for 10 minutes. So one of the issues is, yeah. The gate time might go down to 15 minutes, and so if you leave Churchill open, you'll get degraded amount of traffic, but it might be 300 cars an hour instead of the 450, and so that only another 150 cars an hour or so would have to go to Oregon or Embarcadero. Also, Menlo Park has decided for 3 of their crossings at Encino and the 2 Oak Grove to leave their crossings as is. They're not closing them, they're just going to let them run, and again, the gate time will go from 10 to 15 minutes at worst case, but the cars will continue to cross. And that's important, and that's what Menlo Park's doing, that's what Atherton's doing. So it makes sense, I think, for Churchill to leave it open or come up with some restriction, because on Sunday afternoon, when there's only 2 trains an hour, it makes no sense to actually have closed Churchill. And it also makes no sense, since it's 3 blocks from Embarcadero, it makes no sense to rip up 30 or 40 houses to put in this crazy hybrid thing when it's just 3 blocks away to get to Embarcadero. So we should leave those folks at Churchill alone. That's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Patricia Fester, to be followed by Kate Morin.
Good evening, Council.
I'm here specifically to ask the council to keep Palo Alto a unified community as we move into our future. Please do not physically divide the city east to west with an elevated rail that will hurt the community and our quality of life. Also, please do not divide our city north to south with protection from eminent domain in the north while the southern part of the city is left in limbo. Last week, you discussed eliminating the looming fear of eminent domain for half the city. Please extend the same discussion and protection to the citizens of southern Palo Alto as you did to northern Palo Alto. Also, last week, the council discussed options for Embarcadero and noted that transferring traffic problems into other neighborhoods is not the answer. I would ask that you extend this idea to southern Palo Alto. My fear is that we could be wind up with an Embarcadero South called Charleston Road. This is not helpful. Lastly, we moved here 24 years ago now to grow our community, to be part of something important, to have our neighbors, to protect our children. Imagine eminent domain. In one fell swoop, these children will lose their school, their home, and their community. This is not in their best interest. It does not reflect the tenets of our city. This is supposed to be Palo Alto, Silicon Valley visionaries. I'm suggesting that we go back and we look at another way to utilize our intellectual capital and figure out a way to fund a tunnel from East Meadow to Charleston. So as we move forward in the future, we can continue to grow with managed growth that does not require eminent domain. Thank you.
So, I'm supposed to actually tell you guys not to clap. It is in our protocols, so I think we'd appreciate if you, because there may be different speakers, different views, and people may get intimidated. We really want an open and vibrant conversation where people feel comfortable. Kate Morin, to be followed by Khurshid Gandhi.
So I'll start by saying that I've kind of lost confidence in the city council and the board with the whole Cassaleya issue and not listening to neighbors. And so when I hear like they're going to have an advisory board and we're going to be able to talk about it, I spent part of my career drafting questions that get asked for these type of surveys. And so you said, well, do you agree to this type of wall or that type of wall, or do you have no preference? Well, question D should be, or do you not want any wall? But you never asked that, because that's what I craft. So when I hear this, I'm a little cynical. I would be one of the houses that would be taken, and it's more than just eminent domain. And it's been interesting to hear people, what they think eminent domain is. And I really don't think they have an idea truly what it is. And I think it'd be interesting for the council to let people know what this means. It's more than just a taking of your home. It's, you're relocating your family. You buy another home if you can afford it, like what you have. We've lived here for 20 years. I've raised my family here. So if I was lucky enough to find another house, I would have a new tax base. I wouldn't have the same location. I wouldn't have the amazing neighbors. Neighbors like Neva who drag me out here at night to talk. We're going to miss that. You're going to miss an entire community, a 20-year community. We have 4 families right now in the houses that you'd be taking who are battling everything from cancer to other type of diseases and illnesses. And they're using the energy that they should be getting well, worrying about if they're going to get their house taken, if their home is going to be gone. And I'd like you to consider that. Also, someone who said leave Churchill open because at least you'd have some, you have to think about the horns. When we moved in 20 years ago, much fewer trains going by, so less noise. If you're really going to increase the number of trains going by, maybe you'll get some traffic going over Churchill, but you're going to have horns. How many horns an hour are going to come by? So something else to think about.
Thank you. Khurshid Gandhi, to be followed by Terry Holzheimer.
Good evening. My name is Khurshid Gandhi. I have lived in Palo Alto for the last 14 years. I'm in South Palo Alto, so I'm going to be speaking not as much to Churchill as to all of Palo Alto and maybe a little bit of South. First off, no, doesn't work? Okay. First off, I thank the staff and the council. I know you guys have spent endless hours, and I think you're going to be spending more hours on this before we come to any sort of a decision, as it should be. I had on this actually the old Hatch McDonald data. And the reason I was going to put it up is because our neighborhood, as most of Palo Alto, is very seriously concerned about loss of property. That is a huge thing. That's what causes panic in people. It's breaking up communities. You've heard that ad nauseum. You'll continue to hear it ad nauseum probably. It is really important. And one of the tables in this old report, and I understand it's from 2014, we don't have any further information from AECOM, so I can't go on current data, is where they had a trench where 0 property acquisitions were forecasted. So it seems like it's something that can be done, and as other people have said, let's get creative. It's a huge 100-year project that's gonna last, and let's get creative for funding. I understand that's difficult, but please be visionaries and don't just take the easiest way out, okay? Thank you so much.
Terry Halsheimer to be followed by Penny Elson.
Good evening, council members. I'm here tonight to support the citizens and the neighbors that are very concerned about the possible use of eminent domain and the removal of their homes in North Old Palo Alto. I don't think that this should be an optional thing in this neighborhood or any other neighborhood in Palo Alto. Any removal of use of eminent domain of that option should be consistent throughout the entire city. I hope that Old North Palo Alto will not be the only exception tonight. I hope it will be the rule for the entire city. I would also like to add very quickly that the other options, particularly south of Palo Alto, the partial trench option or even the tunnel option, is something that seriously should be considered. I think you've heard from a lot of citizens tonight that they're willing to put their money where their mouth is. And I think it's time for the city to realize that, and also realize that the business community, which is the heart of where our problems remain in terms of the traffic and congestion, need to pay their fair share. One final item I'd like to quickly mention is, and that is, during the Caltrain electrification project, I'd like to see the council insist, along with the city of Atherton, of the use of the single pole option between the tracks. The Caltrain option that they've given Palo Alto is not that. It's more of a multiple use of several poles on both sides of the tracks, which will remove several heritage trees and a lot of the vegetation along the tracks. So I would highly recommend that the city consider the single pole option. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Penny Elson to be followed by Emily Hung.
Thank you. I'll be quick. So I've been really interested in all the comments this evening, and I have to say I really appreciate the ones that are moving toward working with staff towards solutions, and also considering the needs of other people in other parts of town. I really think that it's going to be important for all of us to try to put ourselves in other people's shoes, because this is going to be hard on everyone. My inexpert read of the available traffic studies suggests to me that Embarcadero and Churchill work in tandem. I think we need to understand that dynamic better. I hope that council will consider improvements to Embarcadero. If you're going to be moving traffic from Churchill that direction, we're going to see increases in traffic just from Stanford's growth. And you're going to see more increases in traffic from diversion from Churchill, I suspect. So I just want to say, we saw with the first library bond measure how unwilling North Palo Alto was to support a project that mostly benefited South Palo Alto. A bond campaign will need to provide benefits to all parts of town. Residents of neighborhoods citywide are going to need to feel that their needs are being met. So we need the whole community to support this, to support the final projects and a probable future bond measure. And then I have one more thing, which I noticed while I was reading these staff reports. I'm just starting to educate myself on this. I noticed that with the hybrid options, there's like an 8% grade. And I'm a little worried about that from a bicycling perspective on school routes. That's a pretty steep grade. In the climbing cyclist, a 7 to 9% grade they describe as starting to become comfortable for seasoned riders and very challenging for new climbers. We're talking about kids here, guys, lots of them.
All right, Emily Hung to be followed by David Shen.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Emily Hung. I'm representing North Old Palo Alto and the neighborhoods. Nearly 500 members have signed our petition. So our position is we strongly urge the council to support and approve the Rail Committee's recommendation to remove the two hybrid options from Churchill and further research any consideration on that options. I would like to echo all the other previous speakers. Churchill Avenue is a very small street which only runs through 7 blocks. And it really connects a very short street, and spending over hundreds of millions of dollars on doing this crossing and spending the effort of everybody is really creating very minimum benefits here. And I feel like council member, all the budgets would be well spent on other more meaningful crossing for more traffic there. At the same time, I also like to make a point that Mountain View, if you have heard, and they have already started reaching out their business owner, Google, all the big company to support their grade separations budget. So I would really hope the committees would consider to reach out a big company like Uber, also here in Palo Alto, and also Tesla. A lot of big companies, especially Stanford, they should put in their effort to support our grade separation. They have been using a lot of cities' facilities and all the fundamental things. They should really pay their, and they would be the one of the most beneficial for this grade separations, all the train track and all the traffics. So again, I want to reiterate, we really strongly support your approval of this motion recommended by the Rail Committee. Thank you.
Thank you. David Shen to be followed by Jason Matloff.
Distinguished City Council members and staff, my name is Dave Shen. Over these many months, I've spoken on behalf of the North Old Palo Alto Group on the rail grade separation project. Tonight, I still speak on behalf of NOPA, but more so on behalf of me and my family. I came to Palo Alto in 2008 and moved into my current home in 2010 on the 100 block of Churchill. I look forward to raising my children here, taking advantage of the excellent schools and also the excellent lifestyle that the city of Palo Alto provides. This all unraveled late last November when I heard that there was a project underway that could undermine all that we had hoped for in moving here. That was the threat of our home being seized out from under us through eminent domain. I then set on a path to learn how to advocate, how to gain community support, how to execute a petition. I worked with city officials. I met with city council members. I met nearly all my neighbors, and then some in the surrounding areas. I gained so much in this process that I never thought I would have had the threat not been there. Despite all these positive results, my house still could be seized out from under us. As it stands, we'd probably end up moving out of the Bay Area, maybe out of state. My kids then would be forced to go to another school after having spent years building friendships. The upheaval we'd experience would be unprecedented and stressful. Who can love having their home taken away from them without any say in the matter whatsoever? But we near a potential happy ending to this story. Tonight, we're closer than ever before to removing the threat of eminent domain from my family. I implore you to consider my family and the other 14 to other 40 households who would be upended needlessly if an under or overpass were to be built at Churchill. Tonight, you can change all that. Please support the Rail Committee's recommendation to remove the hybrids from consideration at the Churchill intersection. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Jason Matloff to be followed by Monica Tan Brown.
Okay. Good evening. As you know, my name is Jason Matloff, and I want to say that I'm here representing not only the 450 signatories of our petition from North Old Palo Alto, but it's important to acknowledge there are many, many of our signatories that are from Southgate who are largely in support. I think roughly a third or 40% of our signatories are from there as well. And specific to this discussion, we are adamantly opposed to any solutions that create eminent domain and destruction of the neighborhood through specifically road underpass and road overpasses. So I want to express my and urge you all to please support the Rail Committee's motion tonight to approve the removal and elimination of the hybrid and the reverse hybrid. So for a long time now, members of the community have been asking for data. What are the implications of all the various options and solutions? And I would urge you now to stop and say, that's passed. Now we have data from AECOM, and this is it. It's devastating. It is devastating, okay? We need to move forward now. This devastation results in a 15 to 25 foot hole being built with a 600 to 900 foot diameter in all directions. It's devastating to our neighborhood, to our community, and you've heard it all tonight. So we claim as a community that, and you've heard it from everyone here for nights on end. I've been to I don't know how many council meetings over the last 9 months. I've heard it from you. You sat in my home. We've had meetings here. We've seen you with rail committees. Everybody's opposed to gross eminent domain, with exceptions carved out for corner cases, which I understand. And I also fully understand that there's a need to fully study things comprehensively, every implication of every option. But I would urge you to put your values above politics and process and get to the right decision tonight. Eliminate these options. There's no way, based on anything that's been discussed in the past, that would be consistent with what's been said in the past, that we would approve something, that you would approve something that would take 20 to 40 homes. So I urge you, please do the right thing tonight and take these options off the table. Thank you.
Thank you. Monica Tan Brown, to be followed by Neva Yarkin.
Hello, my name is Monica Tan Brown, and I live on the 100 block of Churchill, and I am a member of the North Old Palo Alto Community Group. I oppose eminent domain across all of Palo Alto. The hybrid solution and the reverse hybrid solution will take my home through eminent domain. A home my husband and I spent 5 years remodeling, a home where I'm raising 2 little boys, ages 4 and 6. This is the home that is our dream, where we expected to stay for many years to come. I live with existential threat that gives me real everyday stress. There are people here who talk about slowing down the process who have no skin in the game. I have a lot of skin in this game. I will lose my house, which would be a huge detrimental impact on my family. I believe in a community outreach program. I'd love to be part of the community advisory panel, but today we need you to remove the hybrid solution from further study. The impact to our neighborhood would be devastating. One of these solutions would take 40+ homes, not only on Churchill and Mariposa, but also on Coleridge and Kellogg. The taking of homes is a decision that cannot be taken back. Let's make conservative decisions where houses are saved. Closing Churchill today does not mean in the future, when a tunnel or a trench is possible, we couldn't reopen Churchill. Thank you, and I realize that everyone has an emotional plea. These decisions you have to make are not easy ones, and I do not envy the burden that you have to bear. But as you vote tonight, please remember me, Monica Tan Brown, and my young family living on Churchill and waiting and hoping that our home will not be taken. Thank you.
Thank you. Neva Yarkin, to be followed by Carolyn Schmarzo.
Okay. Neva Yarkin, I live on Churchill Avenue. All I'm asking is that eminent domain is taken off the table for North Old Palo Alto and Southgate neighborhoods. If it was any of your houses being slated for eminent domain, how well would you be sleeping at night? We have a black cloud hanging over our heads and no let up in sight. This can be studied to death, but it still comes down to the hybrid, which will take 20+ houses, and reverse hybrid, which will take 40 houses, including streets like Kellogg and Coleridge. This was all mapped out by AECOM, the new consultants that the city has hired. If this was being weighed on a scale, wouldn't people's houses precede traffic to another neighborhood? Me, like my neighbors, are fighting like mad to save our houses and our neighborhood. That is our bottom line. Again, we are asking for eminent domain to be taken off the table. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Carolyn Schmarzo, to be followed by Parag Patkar.
Carolyn Schmarzo. I live at 1550 Emerson Street, off and on in Palo Alto for 21 years. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen of City Council. The following is a list of reasons why I oppose the use of eminent domain in Palo Alto. Number 1, irresponsible use of limited city money. Number 2, loss of property equals loss of tax dollars to the city. Number 3, money spent fending off lawsuits is lost money. Number 4, the health hazards it presents to all who live near the demolition area are noise pollution, toxic air, and particulate pollution, emotional and psychological blunt force trauma. It eradicates part of history in Palo Alto, and if is the conditional cause in this clause, if the property is seized, the homes bulldozed by Palo Alto, and when the rail construction is complete and the land subsequently sold to developers for high-density housing, then City Council, we will know that something evil this way came. Something as destructive as a tornado and akin to the Wicked Witch of the East. So, City Council, in the words of Dorothy and Glinda the Good Witch, there is no place like home. There is no place like home. There is no place like home. Please, City Council, throw a bucket of water on the evil witch of eminent domain. Thank you.
Thank you. Parag Patkar, followed by Steve Schenker.
Hello, council members. My name is Parag Patkar. Oh, no, that's all. I just have one slide, and it actually was pulled up by Khurshid Gandhi before, but she didn't show the slide. This was from the old consultant's report from 2014. As you can see in table 1, the trench has no eminent domain consequences. There are no full and no partial property acquisitions for the trench between Charleston and East Meadow. The other options, which are table 2 and 3, that have the hybrid in them, have eminent domain implications. And so I gather that the old consultant has been let go, but I don't know why we shouldn't take this table into consideration, considering the fact that we don't have the facts from or the report from AECOM right now. So that's one. The second is the update on the signatures. We are at about 370 signatures right now on our South Palo Alto petition. And to Councilmember Du Bois, recommendation to the city manager that we have only residents of Palo Alto be part of the CAP committee. I strongly agree with it. Not only that, I think we should have folks who live close to the tracks who are most impacted by it on that committee. As an example, we threw a wide net for our petition that we've got about 370 signatures for. And most of the folks who've signed the petition are in Charleston Meadow, Ventura, south of Midtown, Fair Meadow, Walnut Grove, Reed Meadow, and Monroe Park. 7 out of the 12 communities that live by the track. And I've also sent an email to both the city manager and Rob here, and asking to be included on that community advisory panel. And I'm hoping you take our request seriously and consider us to be included in that panel. That's all. Thank you for your time.
Steve Schenker, to be followed by Megan Kahn.
Well, council members, thank you for all your hard work and your service. I'm also on the Parcel Tax Committee and know how thankless it can be sometimes with all the work that you have to do. I had not originally intended to talk, and I'm not talking specifically about eminent domain because I'm on the assumption that they've heard good arguments for everyone else. I'm more talking about how to think about the traffic flows afterwards, following up on some of the discussions that Stephen Rosenblum and Petrush Fester talked earlier. Right now, the Churchill Road is the only traffic light on Alma that enables a crossing in the direction of El Camino on the north side of East Meadow. Most of the other entrances are circular entrances that have a sharing of entrance between the main traffic and the person wanting to merge on. It's human nature that people will go to other traffic lights in order to merge on, particularly as density increases in the remaining ways to get to El Camino. That means that they'll be most likely going from a traffic flow to Bryant, because there'll be an entrance from Bryant over to Embarcadero, and to Bryant to get to the entrance onto Oregon Expressway, rather than waiting for cars to pile up on Alma to get onto the Oregon Expressway current entrance. And this won't be local residents full-time, but this will be mostly the temporary residents that are generally Stanford graduate students who rent on a temporary basis, who don't have the same level of respect that we have for Bicycle Boulevard. So as you think about the traffic flows going forward, I urge you to think about where the traffic will be routed, and as you consider the options between partial and full shutdown of Churchill entrance, I urge you to think about it as more of a partial than a full close down.
Thank you. Megan Kahn, to be followed by Dean Levin.
Good evening, City Council members. My name is Megan Kahn, and I'm a resident of Professorville. I would like to speak in favor of the Rail Committee's recommendation. It seems from the discussion that we're having, and in my own opinion, that getting rid of the hybrid options is the right way to go for the community. And additionally, I would like to request that more information about the Community Advisory Panel is posted online, specifically how it's chosen, or how one could apply for it, as I was unable to find any information about that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Adina Levin, to be followed by Jason Stinson, our final speaker.
Good evening, council members. Adina Levin with Friends of Caltrain, which is a nonprofit supporting modernized Caltrain and sustainable transportation on the Peninsula Corridor from San Francisco through San Jose. First of all, thank you very much for getting to this point, providing crucial information about, moving stepwise a couple of the key options, and once the information about potential property impacts is available to the community, the logical options become clear that, taking dozens of homes is something to take off the table. One of the things I was very happy to see in the proposal for the stakeholders was that one of the workshops was going to have a key focus on funding and financing. I do hear a lot of people in the community really wanting to have underground options such as a trench or a tunnel. And including willingness to pay, the financial study suggested for a trench between $1,750 and $6,500 of property tax per year, assessed value or market value, and that's about a third or less of the cost of a tunnel. Having the information available to the community in digestible form, not just a report, but really breaking down what the options might be, also including value capture, how many homes or how much commercial space would be needed to generate the relevant amount of money to pay for some of these options that might be more desirable. I think that would be something really, really important to provide to many community members in digestible form, to help people decide which things that they may wish to take on as a community and may not. And having that information available will also, I think, help the community reach good decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. Jason Stinson.
Bring it home. It's done. Everything's been said tonight. I think this hybrid option, what you guys have before you today, which is really, I think there's a lot of opinions. We have a long road ahead of us. Are we going to close Churchill? Are we not going to close Churchill? What are we going to do with the trench? A lot of discussion, and tonight's not really the night that you guys are going to be making those decisions. Tonight's all about the staff's recommendation to get rid of the hybrid solution. I'm in strong support of that. I live on the Southgate side of the tracks. Bad side of the tracks, I guess. It would be devastating to our community. My home would not be one of the ones in eminent domain. In many ways, I think that's actually worse. I would be one of the few left standing on a street that would massively change, and the traffic patterns would change, and the way the neighborhood would be very different. And so definitely not in favor of it. You have a lot of options on the table right now. I think Councilmember Scharf mentioned a few weeks ago the best way to actually attack this is to start whittling down things that just don't make sense. And I think you've heard from pretty much everybody in the community tonight. I think it's pretty obvious, hopefully obvious to you guys as well, that this hybrid solution doesn't make sense. It's a relatively easy one to take off the table and really focus the staff on the options that make the most sense and focus in on the stuff that is going to get us there and get us over the line. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, if you could put the motion up. So a couple things. First of all, I really appreciate everyone come out and speak tonight. Every time we do these and I listen to the public speakers, it sharpens my thinking on these issues, frankly. So these were my takeaways a little bit about the whole process tonight. I didn't hear anybody argue for the hybrid options. And if I got that wrong and someone did want to argue for the hybrid option, please raise your hand, because I don't want to put words in people's mouth. But I didn't, I'll get there. But I didn't hear anyone argue for those. So tonight what we're doing is really very limited, and I got to commend staff. Staff came to us at the Rail Committee and said, you know, we should eliminate these hybrid options because they don't really make sense in the scheme of things. And I think one of the things people have to remember is that, you know, give or take, staff thinks that it's, you know, $250,000 to do an in-depth study of an option. So by eliminating these hybrid options, frankly, we're saving $500,000 that we can then use to study other options and study other options more in depth. So in listening to the speakers tonight, I really think I heard unanimity on getting rid of these two, the Churchill Avenue hybrid options and the reverse hybrid option. I heard people talk about that some wanted to close Churchill, some did not want to close Churchill, some wanted to have, you know, the partial closure. I heard a lot of that. We're not making that decision tonight. In fact, what we're doing is we are leaving all these options open. And that's an important thing to do, because what it allows us to do is study it. And I actually wanted to particularly comment on the person that mentioned the light is a really important thing to get onto Alma. Frankly, I use that light all the time. We've had that discussion at the Rail Committee meeting, and that issue is also still open about what happens with the light. I can tell you, I think our discussions have been keep the light, but that's not the decisions we're making tonight either. In removing the language regarding widening Embarcadero Road, that stuck with what we really were hoping to do. That language seemed a little prescriptive, frankly, and was making people concerned. And I don't think that the intention should be to say, we are going to do this or we are going to do that at this stage. And so we removed that language from the opening. And I think what we talked about at that point is, at some later date, if that option comes forward, frankly, then that is the option to have that discussion. But it is not tonight, and it is not the issue about, well, it's not tonight to decide that we would do it, obviously, and that's why we removed that. It's not the decision to put that language in the Embarcadero Road and say, that's something we're going to study. That is a separate discussion that may or may not take place, frankly. And I think the reason I say may or may not take place is because there's really a separate issue at some point of replacing the bridge. And I think the discussion was, at that point, that's when you would have that discussion. So the language basically leaves open all sorts of discussions about how traffic would be handled. And it gives no preference to one or the other. And without doing a traffic study, it's a little hard to say what you would do on that. So I wanted people to understand that we were not advocating in any way that we would add a lane on the Embarcadero, and that we were decoupling that issue from these issues. And that's really all we did at the Rail Committee. We said, let's not advocate for anything in particular. Let's keep it narrow and focused. Let's take the baby steps, and for good reason, of getting rid of these two limited options, which is the Churchill Avenue hybrid and the reverse hybrid, and frankly, break out the Churchill Avenue closure options into closure and partial closure, which seem to make more sense because they should be studied separately. And that's really all the Rail Committee did, and that's really all we're talking about tonight in terms of what our options before us are. I think it would obviously be premature, frankly, to eliminate any other option on this list, even though I think some of these options maybe should be eliminated, but staff hasn't had the opportunity yet to do the work and bring it to us like they have on the Churchill Avenue hybrid options. And that's why those other options were not necessarily discussed. Churchill, frankly, and the hybrid options seemed like low-hanging fruit, and I think that's borne out by the fact that no one here is standing up and saying, we want to see that hybrid option on Churchill. So I just wanted to give the framework of what we were doing as a committee and sort of frame it for everyone so they understood what we were doing. Corey is chair of the Rail Committee. Did you want to add anything to that? Oh, and with that, wait, I guess before I do that, I have a couple things. First of all, Councilmember Tanaka is on the phone. So I don't know, can he talk afterwards or to you? Should I just, at the end of everyone else talk, I will just call on Councilmember Tanaka and see if he wants to. And with that, actually, before I go to Corey, I will actually just make the motion from the Rail Committee.
Second.
All right, seconded by Councilmember Walbach, which makes it easy because now I can turn to Councilmember Walbach, who can.
Thank you for that. So yeah, we did talk about this motion a great deal last Wednesday. Now we have not just two, but with Tanaka on the phone, we now have 3 more council members to help us pick this apart if necessary, or if we want to go home early, we could simply move it forward. But I'm definitely happy to hear any questions or thoughts that Holman, Tanaka, or Du Bois have. I also want to echo what Councilmember Scharf said. Really appreciate everybody who's been engaged throughout this process, and really happy to have everybody who came out tonight. And looking forward through the community engagement process that we were talking about in item 1, getting even more people involved in this conversation. I also want to emphasize that there are, that while our discussion tonight is on things that we're removing, there are still a few other things on the list that I heard people reference. I just want to make sure people realize that the Meadow and Charleston trench or tunnel is still an option that we are going to be considering, and we are going to be spending the money to have our consultants look at that in depth. Also, the citywide tunnel within Palo Alto is another option that we have not taken off the table yet. We know there's a lot of concerns about the costs, but we're still looking at that, and we are going to spend the money to have our consultants look at that in depth. So I heard a lot of people talking about those ideas, and I wanted to make sure people can rest assured those have not been removed from the list of options. And as far as with the hybrids in South Palo Alto, we just haven't, the staff, the consultants just have not had an opportunity yet to do the kind of analysis that we've done so far, kind of the preliminary analysis where we see, but I think it was Jason, held this up before, the devastating impact that we would see from the hybrids at Churchill. We've seen that. We feel comfortable saying that we have enough information now to understand what kind of scale, even though they haven't done a detailed parcel by parcel analysis, we have enough kind of rough estimate to know that it would be devastating. We haven't even done that level of analysis yet with our current consultants and our current work and thinking on the hybrids in South Palo Alto, so we're just not able to make an informed decision there yet. Ultimately, we are going to eliminate most of these options, right? That's the point. We want to narrow down to one preferred option. So over the next several months, as we continue to learn more about these remaining options, we will be eliminating all but a couple. And so I just want to make sure people stay engaged and understand that that's why we're removing these and not some others, just because we have information that's sufficient to make an informed decision here. With that, I hope that people will support the motion. Thanks.
Councilmember Du Bois.
Thanks. So I've been keeping up with the Rail Committee, but I haven't been to meetings, so I have quite a few questions up front. One comment I'd say, the construction costs are large and with temporary tracks. And I'd like to urge staff to see if we can, as one potential option, just advocate for coordinating with other cities to really consider the possibility of a shutdown of Caltrain for a period of time, where cities along the peninsula would do this construction and we would have temporary mass transit put in place with buses to replace that. I mean, I've spoken to Dave Pine as County Commissioner in San Mateo County. He's intrigued with the idea. I mean, it would literally be hundreds of millions of dollars of savings for cities on the peninsula. And then another option there is I also like to see us favor options where we move the track once, kind of like you showed in the Palo Alto Avenue crossing. I think even Churchill, but certainly Charleston and Meadow, if we move the rail to where Elma is today and we considered reconfiguring Elma, again, we could potentially save a lot in construction costs. Are we still evaluating a 2% grade options?
Yeah, that's something.
Tom, you mean in the tunnel?
Just in general. I mean, the allowance of 2%.
In general, yes, we can run profiles at 2% or 1%.
Okay.
It'd still have to be a conversation with Caltrain on whether they would allow the variance to 2%.
Could we, I think we have a number of new people here tonight, maybe just a real quick explanation of the 1% versus 2%, not in depth, but.
Yeah, I thought it was primarily Union Pacific with the freight that was insisting on the 1%.
That's correct.
Okay. So.
Yeah, just to clarify the difference between 1% and 2%, for those who might not know, that has to do with the steepness of the rail line changing. If it goes up for a viaduct or goes down for a tunnel or a trench, typically Caltrain allows projects to have a 1% very slow decline or incline. If we can get them to allow a 2% steeper decline or incline, that would substantially save cost because you have to dig less far, and it makes things it opens up a lot more options, but that's part of a broader conversation with Caltrain, as was indicated by the consultants.
So I guess I was confused by this table which showed eliminating the Palo Alto Avenue hybrid. So is Palo Alto Avenue closure the only option left?
That's not in the motion. It was something that was discussed at Rail Committee last Wednesday.
No, Tom. The answer is that both the Palo Alto Avenue hybrid and or viaduct options are still on the table for the Palo Alto Avenue. Okay. Nothing was eliminated for Palo Alto Avenue.
Okay. I do think, again, I missed a few meetings that the possibility of just leaving Palo Alto Avenue as is with a quiet zone might need to come back.
So that is on the table.
That's not on the grid anymore.
All the do-nothing options. Josh, do you want to address the do-nothing options?
Sure. Do-nothing options are still technically on the table. They would be our fallback, and they'll need to be analyzed when we move into the environmental analysis process. So we thought it would confuse things to keep them on the table of ideas.
Okay. So I think the biggest thing missing from the discussion tonight has been kind of the traffic impacts. And I also would really like to see a process where we have clear criteria that we're applying to decisions. So if we're going to consider a 2% trench, I think we should consider that evenly. If we're going to make decisions based on eminent domain, I think we should do that evenly. And so, if we're considering the 2% option in South Palo Alto, I really think the short trench at Churchill at 2% should be back on the table. And it's interesting looking at the traffic updates. I mean, Churchill has more traffic than Meadow. There's 60 school buses a day. Palo Alto Avenue has 60 transit buses a day. And so if we're going to remove the hybrid options, let's do it consistently. And I think we should do it at the same time. We've heard from a few folks in South Palo Alto who have the same kind of threat of eminent domain, and it just seems very a strange process to just remove it for one crossing. But if we go back to Palo Alto Avenue and Churchill, we're talking about 25,000 vehicles a day. 16,000 at Palo Alto Avenue, 9,000 at Churchill. Where does that traffic go? I really think that needs to be part of our consideration of an option. you know, we have this updated circulation report. The first report, I think, was fairly flawed. We did fire the consultant. But this kind of data is what we really need to make decisions. So these 9,000 car trips from Churchill, if we don't address the interchange with Alma at Oregon or Embarcadero, they're going to cut through the neighborhoods. I think one speaker said they're going to cut through Bryant Street or Bike Boulevard. And so I just think we really do need, I think speakers have made the point that Churchill and Embarcadero really need to be looked at together. They're 500 feet apart. I think Palo Alto Avenue and University need to be considered together. And so when we have an option to close Palo Alto Avenue, 16,000 cars a day, we need to look at that interchange of Alma and University, which is pretty bad and pretty low volume. And they need to be part of the alternative. They can't just be separate steps. So I would really like to see, as we move into community meetings, these 3D mock-ups, that those mock-ups include intersections of Alma with Embarcadero and with University. I know we don't want those cars just cutting through Old Palo Alto and Professorville. I think Penny Ellison made a really interesting point, and I think it was right on, that we should come up with a complete set of alternatives. We need to think about how we're going to fund this thing citywide. And if we protect one street from eminent domain tonight, is that neighborhood going to support a bond measure in the future? We really need a shared community approach. And I understand, you know, speakers, you focus on your own neighborhood, your own situation, but I don't see why we would remove hybrids unless we do it for everybody. And similarly, if we're going to do 2% assumptions for the south, let's do it in the north, and let's consider that short trench at Churchill. So, you know, I understand the new consultants come on board and looked at the hybrid at Churchill, but we have looked at hybrids in the south. We know there's eminent domain there. And so I would propose a substitute motion that would just edit the current motion if you want to copy it over. And so I would replace A and B with just eliminate all hybrids from consideration. Yep, so then I would, if you want to renumber those. So you could delete B. I would delete C because I think we need to understand the traffic impacts, not proposing anything in particular. And then I would add D, or actually I would edit C there, that addressing traffic, well, where it says Embarcadero, sorry, David. Where it says Embarcadero Road, add and University, and particularly the intersections with Alma. And you could delete an underpass area. And then D, I would add to consider a short trench at Churchill with a 2% grade. Yeah, and that would be it. So I hope I made my point about why I think this is a lot more consistent process. So I don't know if there's a second.
Seconded by Councilmember Koo.
All right. So again, I know the Rail Committee has talked about this. They're probably fairly bought into the previous motion. But again, I would just think about what we're doing by eliminating one intersection, saying we're not going to do eminent domain there, but we're leaving it at two other intersections. You can say we'll remove it later, but then why don't we just leave all the options on the table until we remove them? And I really think we need to think about having a clear process and clear criteria as we go through these options. I hope there's no objection to the short trench if we're still looking at 2%. That would address a lot of issues. And again, I really don't think we can separate impacts to Embarcadero and University. Again, those 25,000 cars are going to go somewhere. So I understand the desire to say we're not going to do anything to those roads, but I don't think it's realistic.
Councilmember Koo, want to speak to your second?
So at the Rail Committee meeting, I think I got a lot of people concerned about the reason why I voted no on the recommendation. It wasn't for the hype, it wasn't in disagreement with you about eliminating the hybrid options. I agree with you wholeheartedly to remove the hybrid options. It was the, I think it's C, D, and E that was the road impacts. There was not a full study of the road impacts with the partial closures or with the full closures. And I feel that moving forward, we do need, as Councilmember Wolbach said, that we do need to do our due diligence in reviewing all of our data, as well as not just on paper, but also physically. So I really appreciate what Mr. Levitsky had done, counting cars, taking videos, but also in comparison with what our consultants would come back with. But I think moving traffic from one location to another is not acceptable. At this time in our city, we have a lot of complaints about people sitting in traffic and that there is that the traffic flow is poor. We have congestion. Circulation is poor, and the last thing we need is for any more accidents within our neighborhoods, on our neighborhood streets. I do want to remind, we have arterial streets, we have collector streets, we have residential streets, we have we've spent so much money on these bicycle boulevards and all these bicycle pedestrian transportation plan. Let's make sure that they're all working together and not against each other in conflict, and which is why this is another reason we need to study this carefully and understand what we're making decisions on. Eminent domain is, as a lady had said, is just awful, and we don't want that. So if that language remains this language remains within our ideas. So, I think that addressing traffic is still very important, that we should leave in our consideration and fully take a good look at it. This city is compact. It's not going to our roads are not going to get any more widened, and there's nowhere to go with our roads. So we have to look at that really carefully. Your input is important, and I think our analysis are going to be important in making that decision. And that's why I want to reassure you, that's why I voted for the not to go with the recommendation at the Rail Council. And I do agree with the hybrid, looking at this comprehensively citywide, because this is going to affect everybody involved. This railroad is going through our city, and I think we should be looking at this very, very comprehensively. So thank you, Tom, for making this motion.
City Manager Keene.
Yeah, thank you, Council. A couple of comments, and appreciate Councilmember Du Bois's perspective and concern on this. And obviously, having to be recused has kind of kept you out of a lot of the maybe the earlier sessions we had with the council. I do think that the city developed criteria to use in evaluating the projects, and they were and there was weighting to the criteria, and there was feedback even from the council at times about, did we have the criteria right, or was there the right weight that was applied? And so as we've moved through this process, there's been this effort to apply that criteria as part of the decision-making process. Now, there can always be other factors or concerns that could be raised, but I don't think it would be entirely it wouldn't be accurate to say that this has been done without trying to apply some thoughtful methodology. The second thing I would say is that there has been discussion about using a process that is designed to be iterative and to reduce what we may have to, in a very detailed way, spend a lot of money on and study. And I think it would be a mistake, though, to think that the process we're using is absolutely linear, that's moving from whatever it is, 34 or 40 different options to a smaller number of options to a smaller number of options. And maybe thinking about this in terms of concentric circles that get smaller and smaller, nested within each other. And I don't think, in one sense, and I hate to sort of say this because it might sort of set off alarm bells for folks, that theoretically nothing is ever completely off the table as you move to this process until the council makes the absolute final recommendation on the preferred alternative. If you were to take things off the table and say, we really see that the criteria as we're applying them right now would say that this should be removed from consideration, should not be really studied further. I mean, we may look at the implications of traffic and some of those things. That doesn't mean that if we got to the end of the day working through other options and it was all just a complete mess, that the council couldn't sort of say, well, wait a minute, we've got to rethink this a little bit. Now, I don't think we will get in that place, but obviously, I've made this point, I think this is really true. I think this is the biggest infrastructure decision that has faced this city in generations. And by the time you get to the end, you are not going to be being casual about anything. The last thing I would say is that I actually do think that whatever the thing was about eliminating all hybrids from consideration is actually kind of counter to the idea of a process that we have developed. That doesn't mean that those won't be eliminated, but we have at least gone through some degree of review and analysis on those being recommended at this point that we have not done to the same commensurate degree as a prelude to being able to come to the council. So I think this is just disconnected. It's certainly disconnected in time. And I would suggest, there may be difference of opinion on this, I just don't see at all how the process or the cities is harmed by making these decisions in an iterative way and not having to make every one of them simultaneously. We're going to be back pretty quickly talking about the other locations. We'll be certainly talking about the hybrid versus trench versus tunnel and those options. You guys are going to go on break. But this was the opportunity to still indicate how you are narrowing your focus, and in particular, if we're going to spend $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 potentially on options, to be as judicious as we possibly can in making those decisions right now. So I would just offer those as some bit of commentary on why I think that the recommendation that we have is justified and makes sense and does not harm the council's options in the long run. Thanks.
So I would agree with the city manager. I actually will take it a little further and say, I think we do have a process. We've been following the process, and the process is an iterative one whereby we look at options and we try and narrow those options to study given the expensive costs of studying each option. We have not yet studied the options at Meadow and Charleston. To eliminate all the hybrids right now is an ill-considered move, frankly. It is too, what's the word? It leaves us no other options except for the trench or the tunnel, basically, or the viaduct. We've heard from South Palo Alto that they hate the viaduct, frankly. I mean, I've heard that over and over again, that they hate the viaduct. Personally, I think we may very well end up closing Meadow or something else like that. But closing Meadow and Charleston, that would be a serious issue. That may be what people want to do in South Palo Alto, but I doubt it. I think we have to look seriously and take those options and say, what are we going to do? Obviously, I think the trench is a very serious option down there, which is probably the one we end up doing. But the trench has a bunch of impacts that people need to study and understand. So to just take all of that off consideration, I think gives us very little options without considering it. And I'm actually really surprised, Councilmember Du Bois, in that you're always arguing for slowing the process down, going slowly, understanding it, collecting the data. And this seems, you haven't been part of the rail committee this year, you've been recused. We narrowed it down to 10 options. We're taking 2 off to give these people peace of mind in terms of eminent domain, and that you'd want to take that away from them, frankly. And I was actually I was a little surprised, and maybe you can elaborate on what you mean by, if we take the eminent domain if we take the eminent domain option off the table, why would they engage in the process, and why would they vote to tax themselves? And so therefore, we should leave eminent domain on the table for them? I heard you say that.
Yeah, you want me to respond?
Yeah, I do. I was sort of shocked by that, frankly.
So what I'm saying is, we have studied eminent domain in the South, which somebody put up a slide that showed the takings. And so if we were going to eliminate, if the reason we are eliminating hybrids is because of eminent domain, let's do it consistently. And so I made the motion really to point out kind of what I perceive to be an illogical process here. And I think, again, Penny Ellison stated it similarly, that, you know, if we're basically giving part of town a solution, I'm not suggesting that we're going to do eminent domain. I'm suggesting that they're not going to be engaged in the process. So that's the concern. If the criteria here is eminent domain, that's what my motion's trying to achieve.
I don't think the criteria is necessarily eminent domain. I think the criteria is a range of issues that are site-specific that we've talked about. And we could go back over them if you want, but I mean, I think there's a wide range of things. The underpass, basically you would be building Embarcadero on Churchill. You would basically destroy the entire Southgate neighborhood and a lot of old Palo Alto right there. I have yet to hear a single person come forward and say we should do those hybrid options. So we have not had the discussion.
My motion accomplishes that. It removes the hybrid options.
But we have not had the discussion in South Palo Alto about that. And what you do is you may very well force the issue of closing both Churchill and, closing both Charleston and both Meadow by leaving the council no other options and not studying these things carefully. I mean, we may very well decide not to do any eminent domain, but it is, without studying the issues, it is too difficult to make that decision tonight. So, I mean, obviously you can make the motion, but I think I really frankly think it's very ill-considered and actually creates chaos in the process rather than being a well-considered, you know, basically our process has been to slowly remove options on an iterative basis after thoughtful study and consideration and after listening to staff on it. And by doing this, you basically remove stuff without any staff consideration or staff input. And I just think that creates chaos in the process and makes it difficult to have a path forward. The other thing I think that we need to think a little bit about is, you said consider a short trench at Churchill Avenue. We removed that option, and I think Josh needs to explain why. I believed it was, the reason is that it wasn't easy to do given that we'd have to impact. I don't know, Josh, I'll just let you explain it.
Sure. Eddie did some analysis on this after the rail committee meeting last week. I think it was last week. So shallow trench option or the short trench option, the short trench option at Churchill, because of the constraints Eddie outlined earlier, the Embarcadero undercrossing and the Cal Ave station platforms, you just can't get down far enough to go underneath Churchill at its existing elevation. So what Eddie did over the past week, based on some comments from the rail committee, was she looked at a 2% hybrid at Churchill. So going down, from the Cal Ave station at 2%, and she can tell you what kind of impacts that has. Again, these are just very high-level estimated impacts, but it actually doesn't reduce the impacts as much as you would expect.
That's correct. So we did an initial study of trying to maximize the grade down starting at Embarcadero. And to go to the point is when you're looking at 1%, 2%, it's not a linear review of that profile, because we also have to consider the vertical curves and the tangent curves in order to get that grade down. So sometimes you're trying to achieve 2% and the maximum you can achieve is something less than that. And that's actually what occurred on the profile from coming down from Embarcadero, is the maximum we could get down was at 1.5%, because we have to take in consideration the entry grades and the exit grades as well, and the vertical curves and tangent curves on that alignment. However, given that, looking to maximize the trench from Embarcadero through the California Avenue station, is that we were only able to achieve a 7% lowering of the railroad at Churchill based on that. And then again, given the vertical clearance requirements for a road over a railroad track, which is at, we considered a 24.5-foot vertical clearance, plus the structure, that put the roadway up about 22 feet in the air. And with that 2%, we were only able to look at a reduced impact from 46 properties down to 39 properties. So we just couldn't get the rail down enough to get a fully depressed trench at Churchill.
Okay. Sure.
It looked like you only looked at a hybrid with connections to Alma. Did you look at it without connections and also closing off cross streets like Mariposa rather than depressing Mariposa? It seems like you didn't minimize the impacts. There were some side streets, Kellogg and other streets.
We did not look at that. The consideration was, one of the things that was brought up by, I think, one of the comments was to potentially a cul-de-sac Mariposa. And if you did that, you would have some reduction of impacts. If you took Alma down, you're already getting down, pretty deep for, we're at 15.5 feet, so the profile for keeping Alma as a structure would probably be about the same impacts as we're showing here, but we'd have to take a closer look at that. Because again, it's the vertical clearance of keeping the road down underneath a roadway, which again, you'd have, we would assume you'd want to be at a 15-foot clear, as opposed to the 15.5-foot clear that Caltrain requires. You could go to a 15-foot clear or something less. Caltrans recommends a 15-foot vertical clear for local roads.
Yeah,
So,
analysis we had done before, the impacts that varied quite a bit with maintaining connection to Alma versus not, and that was really kind of the question. And then Mariposa, Kellogg, Coleridge, those could all be cul-de-sac, I guess, which would also minimize. But so it seems like we did kind of worst case analysis. Is that fair?
as Josh mentioned, this was a high-level evaluation of looking at this alternative at this point in time. There, you could potentially look at additional impacts or variations of that. That's true.
Okay. Councilmember Holman. And then to be followed by Councilmember Tanaka, who's on the phone.
you want to do him first, since he's
I'm happy
at
to
a
do
later
him
time?
first.
He's at a later time frame, so
Yeah,
I
no, I'm
think it's,
happy to do him first if he wants to speak.
I think it's considerate to do that.
Sure. Councilmember Tanaka, would you like to speak?
So a couple questions. Councilmember Du Bois, so what if we just change the substitute motion to say eliminate, because I think what you're trying to do is you're trying to get rid of the options that require eminent domain. And I'm incredibly sympathetic to what you're saying, because I know kind of the hardship that all the families that might get their house eminent domain are probably feeling, right? I mean, every night that goes by, they're thinking, well, will I still be here tomorrow or not? And so I think that's a very worthy consideration. So what if we just, instead of A, we just say eliminate all ideas that require full eminent domain? What if we did that? Would you be open to that?
I'm sorry, so you said eliminate all ideas with full eminent domain, so allowing...
From consideration, yeah. So instead of all hybrid ideas, because I think what you're trying to do, and I think I understand, you're trying to respond to the community, right? The community is expressing, tremendous concern about losing homes, right? And I get that as well.
Yeah,
and
I'm
so,
trying to be consistent as well, but yeah, I would
it's gotta be
accept that.
consistent, right? Okay, great. Okay, and then the second question for you is, I also believe that we shouldn't be pushing traffic from one neighborhood to another. So I don't think, and I guess I'm just trying to understand option C a little bit. I don't think we want to necessarily widen Embarcadero, because that's like pushing traffic from, let's say, Churchill to Embarcadero, and I don't think that's a good option either. So I guess, I don't know if you or staff, can someone respond to that? I'm trying to understand what that says, because it's not really clear to me.
If I understand your question is, what is option C on the substitute motion?
Yeah, exactly. Because I guess my main thing is, I think we don't want to be pushing. Okay, so let me kind of tell you my rationale here. We have a very engaged community. We're talking about project of the century, probably, right? Or certainly multiple generation project, probably the biggest thing we're ever going to be doing here. And I could just imagine. I mean, certainly budget's a big issue, right? We have to figure that option out. But I think that options that pit one neighbor against another, or options that take away people's homes, I think is just not the Palo Alto values that we have, right? I don't think that's what we're trying to do. And so option C, I just want to make sure it's not going to be pushing traffic onto Embarcadero.
Well, I'm not saying we would widen Embarcadero, but I'm saying we need to improve those intersections with Alma, because if the traffic's going to try to get to Embarcadero
I think that
somehow.
The whole light synchronization and all that kind of stuff definitely needs to be improved. There's no question about that. But some of that is the El Camino issue, right? We don't necessarily have control over that. So, but definitely the whole intersection is not the greatest. But I think the thing that I really want to make sure we avoid is pushing traffic from one neighborhood to another. And so, you keep what you have, but if you could add something in there that says to avoid pushing additional traffic onto Embarcadero, I think.
I'm saying there's 9,000 car trips that they're going to go somewhere. I'm not sure we can say.
So I don't believe that's factually accurate. In fact, I think that's incorrect. Jason, why don't you come up and tell us how that's factually incorrect?
What's not accurate? The 9,000 on Churchill?
So there are 9,000 cars that traverse Churchill. This is from the Mott McDonald traffic circulation study. They traverse Churchill as an intersection, but they do not cross the train tracks. 25% of that traffic crosses the train track. Half of that traffic goes in the west direction. It would impact the Professorville folks. And I think we should respect and figure out a way to do that, but let's please not use totally fabricated numbers or misunderstand numbers. It's not helpful to this discussion. There are not 9,000 cars that traverse the trains that would be dislocated and routed through the Professorville area. And this is from the Mott McDonald study. I'm happy to give it to the clerk. This is cut and paste directly
So
from the Mott
I have
McDonald
the study
study.
here. I don't want to get into an argument, but it's 150 per day each direction, and it's the same numbers we're using for the other intersections. So that's what I'm talking about. We need consistent data. So I don't know if Josh can explain the table.
Whatever the data is,
Where you have the summaries.
what I'm trying to do is capture the thought of not pushing traffic to other people's neighborhoods, right? I just think that's not the right thing. So,
That's
so
why I was
don't
trying
know-
to capture the intersection to not force traffic onto side streets.
Sorry, what'd you say?
Okay.
Sorry, Tom, I didn't understand you.
Josh, can you address the numbers, please?
So tonight, what we're recommending is simply narrowing from 10 down to 8 ideas. As we move forward, we'll do thorough traffic analyses of any of the impacts of the alternatives that we elect to, do a more thorough analysis on. But a lot of this is really speculative right now until we are able to identify the alternatives that we need to perform the analysis on. And, all of the traffic impacts from each of those alternatives will be clearly identified. And the necessary mitigation measures will also be identified. And I think at that point, we can have the kind of discussion that we're having about what impacts to the neighborhoods will be, where the traffic is going to go, what type of improvements may or may not be required to mitigate some of those traffic impacts.
City Manager.
I'm finding this an interesting discussion right now, since it's sort of a counterpoint to our usual approach to say that we don't have enough data and we need to look at more data, and we're actually sort of foregoing data. If we're going to say, let's not have any traffic put into some other neighborhood. I mean, does that mean 2 more cars? I mean, I think that there's some deeper discussion, and we're just beginning. I mean, this is designed to be an evolving, iterative process. And we're going to go back while you guys are on recess, and our consultants are going to look at the hybrid options on Charleston and East Meadow ultimately in a little more detail with us so that we can report back to the committee and then the council ultimately, in the next stage of this work. I mean, if what you want to do is actually throw, no pun intended, roadblocks up right now to every option except for the tunnel, we can do that, and then we can talk money, and we can talk 2% grade, which we don't have control over, and we can talk about the fact that other jurisdictions are going to be involved in the decisions, and those are as big of roadblocks as anything else, and so we're not going to do anything anywhere. I just would ask that you trust the process that you've already sort of laid out. There's always the chance to come back some if you need to.
Jim, I'm not sure what you're saying, Jim, about not using data. Again, I think the question was about the traffic counts they're summarized here, but it's data from a study that we commissioned last year. I mean, it's data that we have, right?
I'm just sort of saying, if we're sort of talking about we don't want to redirect traffic in any way at all.
Right, that's not what I was saying.
Okay,
I was saying we want to try to improve
Tanaka
the
was saying
intersections.
that.
Yes, but a member from the public came up with numbers. I'm just trying to say we have a revised circulation study that was fundamental to our rail planning, so I think we need to use the data that we have. I think there could be concerns about the accuracy, but I mean, the top of this table that's up on the slide there, it shows the weekly totals for each intersection, right?
I don't want to argue with you about it, but I mean, if you have that concern, and then to say, let's just, without even looking at the hybrid implications in some detail at Charleston Meadows, say, let's apply the same hybrid, then potentially that same traffic problem's going to occur down there, and you're replicating what it is that you're also criticizing. And what we're doing by, in a sense, prioritizing where we think we need to go in an iterative way is we're sort of narrowing our focus for the deeper dive That's all we're doing. It doesn't ever completely eliminate, nothing, look, this is Palo Alto. Nothing is ever completely eliminated anyway until you actually make the very final decision. But this is to allow us to really kind of get clearer about what we need to focus on and study and use our consultants as efficiently as we can. And I've probably overspoken.
Councilmember Holman?
Councilmember Tanaka was complete, I guess?
Hello?
I think he was. Are you done, Councilmember Tanaka?
No, I wasn't.
Oh, okay, continue on. It's a little hard to hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry
Speak
about that.
slower.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, so I understand what you guys are saying in terms of, we're not necessarily taking everything completely off the table, right? This, until the final decision, I get all that. But it does cost money. So I think Tom Du Bois is making the right recommendation in terms of trying to, reduce the cost of exploring all these different options, especially ones that a lot of residents really don't like. I think we have 1,000 signatures on one petition and 300 something on another petition. So that's a lot of public outcry. So we could always go back and pay for these additional studies for the hybrid options. So to me, it seems like the more prudent choice to go with kind of this shorter list that Tom's proposing here. And then we can go back out later if we have to, kind of like the city manager says, and spend additional money if we have to. But, we also gave our city manager the charge of trying to cut $4 million from our budget. And so to ask him to do that yet, explore every option in the sun is also quite expensive. So I think, to me, Tom's choice makes a lot of sense here. Okay, so I think in option C, I think I'm not completely satisfied, but, if the option comes back where we're going to, put all of the traffic onto Embarcadero, that's not the option I'm going to support. And I'm pretty sure a lot of people along Embarcadero aren't going to support that either. So, but I think it's fine the way it is. Okay, and then one other thing I wanted to ask you. This is the last topic from this one is in terms of the. And by the way, I'm getting a terrible echo. I don't know if you guys will get echo too, but I'm getting an echo here. But anyways, one of the speakers talked about, one of the public members talked about, doing the fiscal analysis to see what it takes to, for instance, finance a tunnel, right? How much value capture will we have to do so that we can actually make the public can help make a logical choice in terms of what is the right option. Will this be done as part of the current motion, or do we have to add it in? Hello?
Could you repeat the question, Councilmember Tanaka?
The question is, are we going to evaluate value capture as part of this motion, which is always essentially, for the most part, been coupled in discussions with the tunnel alternative. So either does the city sell the development rights all along the right-of-way, which we don't own, of course, and develop in a very dense fashion, or do we somehow populate the city with lots and lots of TDRs to densify other areas of the city and I think we have had some general discussions that make that a very, very problematic recommendation for the city. And I would think that's sort of that's an additional sort of directive that I think the council would ultimately ask us really to do, because it involves a lot of other policy issues for this city as it relates to existing zoning and density and all of those sorts of things that are a little bit outside of just this process.
Councilmember Tanaka, maybe you could just clarify for everyone what you mean by value capture and what you're looking for the city to do. I think that would be very helpful. And why don't you explain your vision of that?
What's not necessarily my vision. My vision of this is I want to give Palo Alto the option of what it would take to finance undergrounding Caltrain. And so I think it's important that the public understands that, because if that's an option that they really want and they're willing to take what it means to do that, then in fact, I think this should be like a ballot initiative. I think we should give the members of the public options. And you say, here's what it takes for us to do on the ground, here's what it takes for us to keep that grade, here's what it takes for us to do whatever. And in that way, but have them fully studied so the public understands what does it mean to do different options. And so for me, my vision is to give Palo Alto kind of the means of how to do each of these different options that we want to do. And so that's what I want to make sure that I want to make sure that the public has information in terms of what would it take to do something like this. And so if this is not part of the current motion or substitute motion, then Tom, I'd like to ask you that we make this maybe item E, that the staff does a study of using value capture or other financing mechanisms to help finance the various options. And that'll be option E.
So Greg, I understand what you're saying, but it just doesn't seem to fit. This isn't a funding discussion. It's not a tunnel discussion. So it just doesn't seem to be the right point in time to do that.
Can I jump on the right point in time? No, I think that is the point. The tunnel option is still in the list of alternatives that the city is going to study. And we'll be talking with the Rail Committee and the council as those components come forward. And the council will have to make some discussions about whether you continue to proceed with studying or do you reject one of those options. And so clearly funding is going to come in to be a factor in the discussion. And we'll have to have done that funding analysis in the future when we get to that point.
If I may add, Mr. Chair, this item is broadly agendized, but the funding piece does go beyond what we've noticed to the public. We really are supposed to be looking at narrowing down and eliminating.
Okay, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Councilmember Holman. Oh wait, Councilmember Tanaka, are you done?
That's all I have for now. Thank you.
All right. I just had one quick question, then we'll go to Councilmember Holman. Tom, why just eliminate all hybrid ideas that require full eminent domain? Why not just eliminate all eminent domain?
I think he's saying, again, full eminent domain, so if there's underground or partial purchases need to be made, I think we could negotiate those.
If I could ask a clarifying question, there's been some looseness in the language that the council's been using on this topic. So when property that's currently in private hands is needed for a public project, there is an opportunity to seek to acquire the property, and that is always done initially through inviting a voluntary transaction, which often is successful. So if the council would clarify what is intended here, is this to eliminate any option that would involve seeking to purchase a full parcel, or is it speaking more to if that process, if the parcel was required and the process did not result in a voluntary transaction, that we wouldn't go any further? It's hard to sort of assess that in terms of a planning, looking at the project itself, not knowing how that element may in fact play out over time.
And if I could just complicate it by revisiting the fact that there have been some potential need for property in some designs that, don't necessarily result in, say, the loss of a house or a home, but a portion, or in the case of trenches or partial trenches and things, there's often a need for tie downs, which are underground connections, though, which would involve property and could potentially involve the use of eminent domain, but it doesn't result in the loss of
I think that's why full was in there.
Okay, well, that's...
Yeah.
Member Holman?
So is the intention of full eminent domain now clear to staff?
Yeah, well, it's very clear in our mind. No, I'm saying Yes, I think we understand the intent, but you will admit that this is something that anyone could reasonably argue about and disagree about what it really meant when we're in a future situation, correct? So I just would add asterisks to it.
So let me try and some language here that maybe the maker of the motion would consider is eliminate all hybrid ideas that require a complete eminent domain action on a residential property. A complete eminent domain action on a residential property.
Does that include an invitation to enter into a voluntary sale transaction? So no property acquisitions, period. That's the motion.
I'm sorry, what did you say, Molly?
The motion is not to look at any option that would require property acquisition.
So what would the wording be then? Forced or unfriendly?
Again, we can't know that unless and until specific properties were identified that were needed for a public project and conversations would occur between the city and the owners of those properties.
So it is a sticky phrasing, isn't it?
Could I, one of the things that you maybe missed at the rail committee meeting then was, at least on say when we were looking at Churchill, under the two different hybrid options, we were able to at least have looked at some schematic maps that actually showed the number of properties that, I'm not an engineer by choice, but I think we acknowledge that, there could be what we're calling full eminent domain, potentially, of 14 to 40 some houses, I don't know, remember something like that. We're not looking at similar maps on potential designs right now on Meadow in Charleston, and it just seems to me that we'd be better informed that discussion takes place at rail and the council ultimately, and we get a little more specific about what we are looking at talking about. It's a little more.
I mean, we've seen them in the past. Are we thinking they're going to be wildly different?
Wait, just to add something, Rob, I appreciate what Councilmember Du Bois is saying in terms of consistency. And what I think we do have a new consultant, and we were responding to the May 29th meeting where there was just clearly a lot of concern about the taking of properties, and particularly around Churchill. So we had enough time between then and now to take a closer look at that particular intersection and provide you with some information that indicated that these options of hybrids at this intersection were not acceptable given the property impacts. We haven't had a chance to do that yet with Meadow and Charleston, but that's something we certainly can do as a next step and bring back a preliminary analysis of the potential property impacts on those with respect to hybrids. And at that point, it's quite likely that staff would recommend we also don't recommend moving forward with those if there are similar impacts to properties. But we don't have that information tonight.
And I would agree with that. And I'd just like to add that, I think we need to do more due diligence on the Meadow and Charleston hybrids because the context is quite different there. It's not as dense of a neighborhood. A lot of the properties face away from Meadow and Charleston. It's not similar to Churchill. A lot of the properties front directly on Churchill, and Alma is also wider in South Palo Alto. So I'm not saying that they're going to necessarily work there and not have any impacts, but I think I wouldn't feel comfortable unless we did the due diligence to see what the impacts are going to be.
So a couple of things here, three things here. So I appreciate the intention of Councilmember Du Bois's motion subsequent comments. I think it is difficult. This is the full rail line that we're looking at from Palo Alto border to Palo Alto border. And it's very difficult to look at things piecemeal because, it could be that somebody who's coming from Oregon is going to decide, to go to, Charleston as opposed to University. Just instead of taking a typical cut through on Churchill. It's like we don't exactly know where the traffic is going to go. And so it's very difficult to have kind of a piecemeal action. I appreciate trying to eliminate some things. I appreciate trying to give some comfort to property owners. I was hoping that what the staff would do in trying to look for some language in A is, rather than raise questions about does that mean this or that, was to help the council members who are working on this try to come up with some language that would accomplish what we're trying to accomplish, so that staff could be a resource for helping us accomplish that. I also have some, but that hasn't happened. I also have some concern that, I've spoken a lot about not using terms North Palo Alto, South Palo Alto. I think that just continues the divide. I'd rather talk about our community as, Meadow, Charleston, Churchill, whatever. And I have some concerns that taking an action here that addresses just the Churchill Avenue area is going to be viewed as, to some people's perspective, partiality to quote-unquote North Palo Alto, because sadly that north-south conversation still goes on, and I wish to goodness it didn't. But I do have that concern. Jim?
Thank you. Let me try this on, rather than wordsmithing, whether it's full or complete, which still creates problems. To give you, under A, what you could say so that we are clear, that we are following the same process we followed on Churchill, which was getting a direction to take a look at the impacts, coming to the council, and then making a decision, is that you direct staff to analyze and return to council in August with reports on the impacts of the hybrid options on properties at Meadow in Charleston. And you would be in the same place to be able to look at, more accurately what the property impacts would be. And you'd be in the same position to then start to say, give some direction as to, well, let's not do this further in-depth study on hybrids at those locations or some other alternative. That's probably 2 or 3 meetings from right now.
Yep, I appreciate that suggested language. So I would actually attempt a friendly amendment to the original motion based on all this discussion to add this language to the bottom of the original motion. And then to address D and E still concern me, and that, again, we have this traffic. But I guess it would be to include more of the language that I have in C and within E, to account for kind of the intersection of Alma and Embarcadero in particular.
So so I understand it. The F is fine, obviously. That's a good friendly amendment. And then you want to add your language, which is study additional options for the Embarcadero Road and University, particularly at the intersections of Alma Street. Is that correct?
Yeah, and
That's fine with me,
because
too.
this doesn't include Palo Alto Avenue.
What?
I mean, I had added university because, again, I think kind of both are there, but we could wait for Palo Alto Avenue to talk about university. But does that make sense?
Sorry. So you wanted to add in, you did want to add in the C or not? I was confused, or were you saying something different?
Yeah, so on E, if we can include kind of the intersection with Elma in that description.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And I was just explaining why I had university in my original motion. I could drop it for now, but I think, again, we need to think about where all this traffic goes, and university would come back with Palo Alto Avenue.
Okay. All right. It's fine with me. Corey wants to speak to it.
So I want to be clear, you're dropping the substitute motion and now proposing an amendment to the main motion. Is that correct?
Yes, a substitute motion that captures really an intent to have look at these eminent domain taking citywide.
Right.
Yep.
I think I understood you, but I just want to make sure we're taking that off the screen just so everybody's on the same page about what we're trying to do here. Okay. So with the substitute motion gone, now looking at this proposed friendly amendment to the main motion. So I was actually I was thinking that what we might just say is, addressing some of the comments we heard from the public, including some letters, but maybe a kind of more concise way to say it is just to say in the Embarcadero Road area, right? Implying neighborhoods like Professorville that are adjacent to Professorville, but without going to all of the details, to just say, addressing traffic in the Embarcadero Road area. And I'd be okay with also including, what was actually the part that, yeah, and how about just and broader traffic impacts?
I think that's more confusing. I mean, Embarcadero goes from 101 to Stanford. And really, it's intent of the exchange with Alma.
Oh, then how about the Embarcadero Road and Alma area?
Oh, okay, that's what I was trying to say.
Oh, sorry, yeah, that's the word that was missing. Originally it said Embarcadero Road underpass, so that's what it should say, is the Embarcadero Road underpass area. Right? Because that way
so what's the
we're looking at
difference?
the system around that intersection and its relationship to Churchill, right? That's what we're trying to get to, is trying to think of this as a system and how making a change to one part of that system affects the others. I mean, honestly, my understanding from staff, the consultants, is that with all of these options, there's going to be a lot of traffic study, but what we're trying to do here is send a message that this one in particular is worth special consideration. And I'm okay with doing that because I think it's important. You wanted to speak again, right? Does that capture what you're trying to do?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the objection to intersection is, but if area works for you, that's fine.
I don't think so. Okay. Yeah, so I'm okay with that.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, just a quick clarification on F, if we could, with your indulgence. One, so we're focused on what we're doing with our consultants, that the impacts to the properties, with the report on the impacts of hybrid options to properties at Charleston and Meadow, number one.
Well, we want to know for all of them, frankly, right?
What?
But if we can't do it all by August.
Yeah, we can't get
if it's a
those
question
done.
of timeline.
I mean, we're talking about trenches and, okay?
Yeah, I would be okay with.
And then
that's the main
in August
focus, right?
or earlier. And I say that because we're going to have some timing issues, I think, with the consultants on the community meetings. It might be the July 30th special meeting we're having might be a better time for us to have had this discussion and advance past that when we go into some of the outreach on the community meetings. So leave it at August or earlier, and we'll work with the chair and on the schedule.
So what language would capture, I think, what the city manager is suggesting that would be, a simpler, more elegant way to phrase it is just say, with a report on the property impacts of MCR and MCL. Right? And transportation staff is nodding.
Well, of course, they're nodding. They came up with those acronyms. Nobody else knows what
No
they
one
mean.
else knows what they
Okay.
mean. I don't think we should use those acronyms.
Okay, well, then let's say to impacts to properties of hybrid solutions or hybrid options at Charleston and Meadow.
Well, I think you're right, though. It's this option here, which includes the Loma Verde bike path, which may have impacts as well.
Right, okay, so it's impacts to properties for hybrid options at Charleston and Meadow. That addresses staff's concern about trying to phase their work and their capacity to do a certain number of things at a time, addresses the key concern that we've heard from people in that neighborhood. It gives us a chance to do that study. I would be okay with that.
So there's one other thing I think we should address, Tom, because I understand where you're going on this, but we want to make sure, what happens if it comes back and it says that in Charleston, we're going to take 3 properties, but then it comes back and says the Trench will take 5 properties. Then we've removed an option that will take less properties. So I was hoping staff would actually come back. If you're going to come back with property takings, I do think, I mean, how do you eliminate options? You at least need to be able to tell us that these will eliminate less properties than the other options on the table. I mean, yeah, otherwise.
That's what we did here with Churchill.
Right, I mean, you have to be able to tell us.
The hybrids have always been a little bit questionable. We recognized when we, put them on the master list of ideas and then, included them in the 10 that they would likely be the first ones that we would need to do some investigation on because they could potentially have pretty significant property impact. So
We will do our absolute best to do what the chair or the acting mayor is suggesting. So you have the context for comparison.
All right. Okay, great. I have 3 lights still. I assume you all want to speak. So, Councilmember Fine, you haven't actually spoken tonight.
Thank you. So I'm glad we got back to the main motion because I think the substitute was inappropriate to our process and what we've done so far. I think, Councilmember Du Bois, it's been almost an hour now since you shared these ideas, but there were 2 things that stood out to me that I think you put your finger on that I think are helpful. So one is this idea of kind of equity in the process across neighborhoods, and I think that's helpful, and that's why I think your substitute motion was actually getting ahead of itself a little bit. The other issue you've talked about is kind of addressing the traffic impacts from whatever we do. And as the city manager put it, are we going to do a traffic impact if there's 2 cars moving to a new neighborhood or an area? And I don't think we actually, to Councilmember Wolbach's point, understand this traffic as a system. We may do something at Churchill or at Meadow or Charleston, and it doesn't necessarily only impact the existing grade separations. It might be impacting Middlefield or El Camino or Page Mill, and we just don't really know or get that yet. And so I think we need to acknowledge and respect that staff will be doing traffic impact studies on all and any of the options that we choose. It's not just Embarcadero, it could be University, it could be Palo Alto Ave, it could be Sand Hill. And so I'm a little wondering why we're just calling out Embarcadero. Is that because we're making the decision about Churchill tonight? Maybe. I have some other comments, but most of them were regarding the substitute motion, so most of this I'm happy with. One thing I will say is we do need to be careful that we don't make eminent domain the only priority and criteria we're using. We do have an adopted list of criteria that the entire council voted on. It is one among many, including cost, constructability, permitting, safety, funding, circulation issues. And I'm a little worried we're using the eminent domain criteria to eliminate options which may have other attributes that we do like in them. And so that's why I have opposed removing all options that contain eminent domain and why I was going to oppose the substitute motion. But for now, I think we're fine here. I would say I think letter E is a little bit of a throwaway. It's just telling staff to look at traffic on Embarcadero. So I don't know how you feel about that, you guys, but those are my comments for now. Otherwise, I think, we should respect the process that the community's put into this. all the work that the Rail Committee has put in over the past 2 years. And as the city manager mentioned, we can resurrect any of these options at any time. Thank you.
All right, Councilmember Koo, then Councilmember Holman.
So speaking about equity, I was actually really hoping that, we could bring peace of mind to both people, all people on this rail path. So that's why I was very excited about Councilmember Du Bois's motion. I can live with this one, but I do want to know the language in terms of D and E, where it says the CAX idea. So what is the language in that idea? Do you have that? Because if we're removing the language of Embarcadero Road, and then studying all the traffic in the underpass area, while we're talking about eminent domain should not be the main criteria, which I disagree with, we still have circulation, which affects safety, and talking about resurrecting different measures, I've had really a lot of difficulty bringing that back, resurrecting anything. So, I do want to know that circulation is not just on Embarcadero, it's also into the neighborhood streets, into Middlefield, into University, coming off the 101 into Stanford. As somebody in the audience had said, that Stanford is going to be growing substantially. And what is that going to do to Embarcadero and Churchill? So that's where I want to know that I can have reassurance that you say, Jim, that what am I talking about? Is it going to be 3 that's going to be flowing into a neighborhood? I think we want to just know whether it's 3 or 100. And this is where I'm going with it. I definitely was not satisfied with the past study that was done by the other consultant. So I do want to see a comprehensive one.
So the past study, the circulation study, was really intended to be a high-level look at what may or may not happen with closures and grade separations. As we move forward in this process and we identify the alternatives for analysis, the 6 to 8 that we've, hoping to get down to, there'll be a much more detailed traffic analysis that will accompany that, and we'll be able to have the conversation about what streets are being impacted, potentially what streets aren't, what are some of the things that might address those impacts. But we're not at that point right now, but we will be there soon enough. And all of those questions you have will be answered.
And this language is not limiting your scope in your circulation and traffic analysis?
No. What we tried to do with the description of the idea was to include a lot of the elements that some of the residents had brought to us about, what they would like to see if we closed Churchill Avenue. But at the end of the day, we're only going to advance things that will address the impacts of a particular idea or option.
Yeah, just to repeat this, D and E really was, removing D was trying to say we're not going to prejudge what a solution is or predetermine a solution and unlink it from the closing. And E really says, let's study what the options really are. And I think I can express safely, I think that is in the spirit of what you're talking about making sure that we're comprehensive in our analysis of the impacts.
There's the will of the people, and we want to make sure we give them peace of mind. But as representatives of the people, we have to be objective as well, which is why I'm very adamant about ensuring that we don't compound on the problem of our circulation and traffic flow in this city. So thank you for the reassurance.
All right, are we ready to vote? I'm sorry, go ahead.
So with the indulgence of everybody, it's like this is such a complicated and complex matter, and it's like trying to get short arms around a large gorilla. And so as we struggle with this, it takes a lot of patience and indulgence on the part of everybody. So I want to thank the public for their patience and the staff for your endurance and indulgence. I think sometimes it doesn't happen often enough, but especially for our new consultants, it's do understand that we appreciate the efforts and the work and your expertise. And it may not always come through that way because we are diligent, as our city manager has said many, many times. There's been no problem trying to get the attention of this council. It's very diligent and committed, and that's why the efforts are sometimes complicated and deep and even dense. So thank you and welcome. So I do have an amendment, and it speaks to it would be in E, and it speaks to the amendment that came forward from the neighborhood. And I've actually changed it a little bit, and it's a little bit longer, so bear with me here. So David, it picks up, add to Churchill Avenue crossing, close CAX idea, quote unquote, study additional options for addressing traffic in the Embarcadero Road underpass area, and picking up, do you have their email? I think it's the second to last page, because some of the language is picked up from that. Okay, ready? Okay. And implement appropriate actions to, and here's where it changes, minimize potential redirected traffic onto residential streets in adjacent neighborhoods. That's a pickup from their email with my change being minimize potential redirected traffic. Onto residential streets in adjacent neighborhoods. And commit to adopting appropriate mitigations to address any impacts. And the reason I'm offering this as an amendment is because I think sometimes, and I've said this before, when you talk about CEQA work, and not everybody in the community is familiar with CEQA, and mitigations sound great, but sometimes mitigations can be worse than the impact. And so what I'm trying to address here is to see that we're trying to minimize the impacts up front as opposed to mitigating the impacts after they've been addressed and anticipated. So I'm hoping that the maker and seconder will accept this amendment.
So Councilmember Holman, with a minor change, I could accept it.
Okay.
So the way it's written, it's very prescriptive, and I think we should study these. So I think it should say, addressing traffic in the Embarcadero underpass area, including actions to minimize redirected traffic, as opposed to implement appropriate actions. Because you want to, as part of the study, understand what it is. You don't want to just say, let's go do it. Okay?
That's good. That's good.
With that change, yeah, I can support that. I'll accept that.
So you take out the word "and," by the way. Just say underpass area, including.
Thank you. I appreciate the addition and amendment there. So good.
Okay. Councilmember Holman, do you have more? Okay. Councilmember Tanaka would still like to speak. So.
Yeah. Can I get the final minutes so I can see it?
So are you on your computer, or do you want him to email? You want him to just read it out? What are you looking for?
Email it to me. Okay, so while he's emailing to me, I want to make a amendment to this, which is to basically put in the because I think a lot of people came tonight to speak about the fear about eminent domain, and I think it's not good
you
for
have
us
to
be
speak up.
out there.
Hey, Greg, why don't you wait until you've got the motion, take a look at it before you offer the amendment, so you know what you're amending?
Okay, I think I just got it. Let me see here.
Speak into the microphone, because sometimes you're like loud and clear, and then you stop being.
Okay, so on F, basically, what I think we want to do is we want to minimize eminent domain. So amendment on F to minimize, so direct staff to answer to the council in August or earlier with a report on the impacts to properties for the hybrid option that minimize eminent domain for Charleston and Meadow. Can you accept that?
Let me read, let's read it.
So just basically adding the minimize eminent domain after hybrid option.
I don't actually understand what that adds.
Basically, I think what's important is that tonight we heard a lot of speakers, not just from the people at Churchill, but even from other intersections, who are really worried about this. And I think Councilmember Cruz is correct. I mean, a lot of people are staying up at night worrying about this, and I think we need to put this to bed.
No, I won't accept that.
Okay, do I have a second?
Seeing none?
Okay. Then the next thing is, what I'd like to do also is, in terms of on E, study additional options for addressing traffic. I think the other thing I want to add is traffic and safety. So study additional options for addressing traffic and safety. Can you accept that?
So I think safety is already one of our guiding principles. I think traffic is, so no, I'm not going to accept it.
Okay. Then let's take a vote.
All right, let's vote.
Can I just make one comment?
No, sorry. We voted already.
We took out safety.
Okay, and that passes unanimously. Wait,
No,
what is
I don't- I
Councilmember
don't
Tanaka?
No, Charles, I vote no.
So Councilmember Tanaka votes no, so it passes on a 6-to-1 vote with Councilmember Tanaka voting no, and Councilmembers Filseth and Mayor Niss recused. Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that's it, right? All right.
We have one more item.
Is what? Oh, verbal report on interagency activities.
And there's nothing staff has to report on this. It's just for the council.
Yes. Meeting adjourned.